Assalamu alaikum everyone. I hope you guys are well and are prepared for tomorrow as well. Some of you also have your math papers as well. How's everything? How are things going? कैसी जा रही है आप सबकी पढ़ाई? And how do you feel about tomorrow? Okay guys, so I'll be just beginning in a minute, and I want you guys to share the link in your with your friends so that more and more people could benefit from this session. This will be definitely be an important session for everyone. इसमें कुछ important चीज़ें discuss हमें करनी है. Okay. I don't think मेरी आवाज़ कम आ रही है. I don't think my आवाज़ is a problem. Guys, is my sound low? I don't think so. Yes, I have heard about the S1 paper as well. That tomorrow you guys have an S1 paper as well. Yeah, guys, we're gonna be sharing. We're gonna be starting in a minute. Just share the stream link in your groups so that more and more people could join. And so I'm gonna be talking about whether we should be. I mean, I can see a couple of questions coming in. And whether we should do the case studies first or whether we should attempt section B first or section C first. This is something that we will discuss. We're going to be discussing in the session today. So whether we should attempt the case study first or whether we should attempt section B or section C first is something that we need to discuss today. So today's agenda is that I'm going to be running you through a revision of the macroeconomics through mind maps that I have, that you can see on your screens right now. Apart from that, we are going to be discussing some evaluation techniques as well. Especially for micro, and then we are also going to be looking at the May-June 24 past papers. May-June 24 past papers we're going to be covering in today's live session. I'll try to cover all the variants today, and because May-June 24 papers are important for your May-June 25 exam. I would not recommend you guys to attempt section B or section C first. My recommendation to you guys is always to attempt the case study first, and I have reasons for that, and I'm going to be telling you the reasons in the live session today. Moving forward, okay. So May-June 24 papers, all variants, you're going to be covering them in this live stream because they are important for your basically they're important for your May-June 25 exams as well. A couple of questions like that could come in your exam. Okay, so guys, as you can see, basically so I cannot honestly comment how long it will be because it's difficult for me to comment right now how long it will be. But you can have a fair idea of approximately 2.5-3 hours minimum. It could exceed that as well. All right. Okay. So moving forward, so what are we actually going to be doing right now is that macro mein you have inflation, you have exchange rates, you have current account deficits, surpluses, and all of those things. We're going to be covering all of that. Basically, we're going to be revising all of that today in this stream through mind maps, right? And as you can see right now, so basically aapka pura through the stream, what will happen is that all of your macro syllabus, hopefully, inshallah, will be revised because of it. So if you can see on your screens, first we have inflation, right? So you guys know what inflation is. Whenever a question on inflation comes, the first two definitions that you're supposed to write is it is a persistent or sustained rise in general price level, and according to monetarists, it's simply the monetary definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. That's the monetarist definition of inflation. So whenever a question on inflation comes, do mention inflation is of two types: demand pull or cost push. Anyways, moving forward, as you can see, what happens is that whenever inflation goes up, right, whenever inflation rises, what happens is that it causes your general price level to rise, and once your general price level rises, what happens is that it means that with the same amount of money, people can now buy fewer goods. So if you have a basket of so let's say if a basket of goods used to cost $1,000, because of inflation it will now cost $1,100, because people's purchasing power has declined unless their incomes are rising proportionally as well. So yes, upper income groups will be able to push up their wages, and that's one of the reasons why the redistribution of incomes occur, because inflation doesn't really harms or affects the rich as much as it does to the poor. That's one reason why inflation causes a redistribution of incomes away from the poor to the rich, making them more richer during inflationary times, right? So obviously their living standards will fall, and when inflation goes up, basically it reduces. So basically, again, what I'm trying to, for those people who are joining right now, we're actually going to be revising the whole of macro through these, mind maps. Inflation causes it basically reduces your real wages, or basically real incomes, because it means that people can buy fewer goods, and the reason is that it's going to lower your standard of living, because if wages would remain the same, right, and prices would increase, the real incomes, that is real income is simply the purchasing power of nominal income, and that falls. So a decrease in real income means that people can't really afford the same quantity or quality of goods and services as before, and this leads to a lower standard of living, especially. And remember that when you're saying in a paper 2 question that the standard of living falls, do mention that for which type of people, because standard of living doesn't fall for rich people in inflation, right? So standard of living falls for low income groups or people who are fixed household incomes, right? So especially for those people who spend, lower income groups who spend a larger proportion of their incomes on essential goods and services like necessities, right? So for them, they are the people who are worst affected, right? So inflation, also guys, do remember that inflation is also going to reduce your real wages, because workers would demand higher wages as well. So real wages is simply nominal wages that is adjusted for inflation. So what inflation would do is that inflation would someone is saying its screen is not clear. I don't think that the screen is not clear. I think it's perfectly clear. Is it fine now, guys? अब सही है? And I don't think the आवाज़ का issue है. I mean, probably you need to check your mic or something. I don't think my voice is a problem here, right? Better you need to attempt the paper in English, so if you cannot understand Urdu, that's not my problem. Anyways, moving forward, basically inflation reduces real wages. So obviously real wages goes down, and what that does is that workers would demand higher wages, because what inflation does is that inflation reduces the real value of money, and it reduces real wages, and workers would then demand higher wages. So your real wages are simply nominal wages adjusted for inflation, and once they gave a 2-mark question as well in case study explaining what real wages are. So if inflation is rising faster than wage growth, remember that whenever inflation is rising faster than wage growth, real wages would decline. So workers would then experience a drop in their purchasing power, which will lead to higher wage demands, because they would want higher wages for compensation. And once wage demand starts rising, the cost of production for firms would rise, and when the cost of production for firms rises, it could result in further inflation, and this could result into a wage price spiral, right? And it just results in, because higher wage demands leads to higher business cost, which then causes more prices to rise because it increases cost plus inflation. So it's just a is, I mean, this wage price spiral is one of the worst situations of inflation, and you need to mention about the wage price spiral, especially when you're attempting a question on how harmful could inflation be, because wage price spirals could be very damaging, because wage price spirals are just a self-perpetuating or a self-fulfilling loop where the economy is stuck into a spiral, and the inflation just becomes very difficult to control, and a lot of huge levels of central bank or government intervention is required to actually control these spirals. It's not contemporary monetary or fiscal measures wouldn't really end up controlling these spirals. Excessive government intervention in the form of contractionary fiscal policies, or very huge levels of monetary tightening, contractionary monetary policies are required to do something about this inflation. Guys, so basically what really happens is that's what inflation does, right? So businesses must, and then there's another problem with inflation. That's basically the problem of menu cost, and that's where businesses must constantly update prices. And menu cost is simply your operational costs, where inflation sort of forces the firms. And what really happens is that when students are mentioning about menu cost, they say that inflation results in menu cost, where they need to change prices. But that's not a good way to explain things, because you see, when you're talking about a point and you're mentioning a point, and you're actually giving a chain of analysis. And if you have entered my final framework that I did, I told you about analysis being the cause, effect, and consequence. So if you're talking about menu cost, the problem with menu cost is that inflation sort of forces the firms. The reason why menu cost is a disadvantage is because it forces the firms to constantly reprice those goods frequently. And it would include printing new menus, updating price tags, modifying your catalogs, and advertising them again. And these are menu costs. And if they're nominal, that's fine, but this could be significant as well. So this is just simply operational. These are operational costs which could be damaging and would sort of reduce efficiency, because these are just unpredictable costs that would constantly arise. Also, guys, inflation. The problem with inflation is that inflation sort of erodes the value of money, and when it erodes the value of money, we know that inflation sort of loses, money loses its value very quickly during inflation. And the problem is that people during inflation, they don't want to hold cash because it's losing purchasing power day by day. So they would want to sort of save their money in those places which could preserve their value of money and the value of whatever cash they have, either in bank accounts or in other sort of assets. Now, if the bank accounts if the real interest rates are going down as well, so putting money into bank accounts isn't really worthwhile as well. So people would want to put in their money in other financial assets, like probably bonds or stocks or something like that. And for that, they need to sort of look up to where is the best possible place that they could save their money, that it doesn't really lose its value. And that sort of inefficiency, it's inefficiency because what it means is that I need to, the whole day or 2 to 3 days would be wasted. Remember in my classes I gave the example that there's this guy, Mr. Ali, who is running here and there for 2-3 days because he's looking for a place where he could actually save his money either in stocks or funds, and that could offer him some return because he wanted to preserve the value of his money. And that is shoe leather cost, because it's inefficiency cost. It's simply inefficiency. It's lost work time, because a lot of that productive time could be spent in work. So that is basically shoe leather cost, right? You see, you need to understand that this word shoe leather cost. This word shoe leather cost is basically it's metaphorically referring to the it's a metaphor, and it's sort of metaphorically referring to the extra effort that people sort of incur to manage cash more frequently, such as they would end up walking more often or switching their bank accounts in search of better interest rates, right? Okay. Ahmed Raza says, can you please explain weighted price average and how is it calculated? Yeah, I already have a video on that on my channel, so you can just check that out. Okay. So क्या है आपकी you know what's basically your shoe leather cost is simply a metaphor that we use to sort of say that, you know, it's basically referring to all the extra effort that people like me and you would take because you want to manage cash more frequently and more effectively, right? Also remember that prices, inflation would mean that your cost and prices become unpredictable, and budgeting would become difficult, and that would reduce business confidence, and lower business confidence would always translate into lower investment, and lower investment would mean वही बात है, again I'm going to say cause effect consequences what analysis is, and lower investment would mean slower economic growth or slowdown in economic growth, or economic growth would decline, right? See, economic growth doesn't declines like that. It first slows down and then it declines. And the problem with inflation is that constant price fluctuations, especially when those inflationary movements are quite frequent and they're quite volatile, and they're abrupt, and then they're unpredictably, and then they're volatile, it would mean that firms and households can't sort of predict how much their costs and prices will rise in the near future. And what this does is that this sort of disrupts planning and budgeting, increasing the risk for firms. And as a result, business confidence would fall, which will lead to lower investments or delays in investment, or probably cancellation of investments as well. And we know that lower investment would mean lower gross capital formation. Lower investment would shift your LRAS to the left, and it would just decline. Initially, it would slow down economic growth, and then it would just decline economic growth in the long run. So that is not good for the economy. So inflation can actually have an impact on long run economic growth as well. If inflation feeds into or embeds into firms, if it embeds into the confidence level of the firms, where they sort of feel that investing is not the thing or the game right now because of lower investment returns, because of inflation is very unpredictable and very volatile right now. So it's not a good idea to invest because inflation is causing economic instability and uncertainty, right? Also, another impact of inflation is that inflation the problem with inflation is that inflation results into the domestic goods being more expensive. Okay. Now, before I move on, I just want to ask you guys that are you guys following what is being taught right now, and सबको समझ में आ रहा है? Also, a couple of things, guys. You cannot, guys. It's not possible for me to give you these mind maps right now because it's just a day before, and I mean, the best I can do is that go through these mind maps right now, but it's not possible for me to give out these mind maps a day before the exam. So I'm sorry that cannot happen, but you can attend the streams and you can learn with us. But giving out these mind maps to a lot of students is not possible. Also, guys, do remember, do you need to understand that so you guys are following. I would just love to hear from you guys. Are you guys following this and all of that? Also, I cannot do this in Urdu because doing this in Urdu is certainly not a good idea. We have some international students as well. Apart from that, you need to give the paper in English. So please don't just constantly ask me to do this in Urdu language, because you need to give the paper in English language. And teaching theoretical subjects It's scientifically proven. We have data suggesting that these subjects like economics and social sciences should be taught in English language. So please don't ask me to teach in Urdu. Also, so current account surplus deficit, Marcus, will be explained later on today as well, hopefully. But it's Abdul Wasi says, could you go through demand and supply topic? Dude, I cannot go through demand and supply topic a day before the exam. I mean, this is just a revision sort of a thing, just to quickly revise, because macro mein, we know that inflation definitely is going to come tomorrow, hopefully in either a case study question or a separate question. Inflation is a question that usually comes in almost all, sort of attempt. Another student says some tips about case study and time management. Okay, so let's do, see, you have to understand that tips about case study and time management will only be done when I am finished with this, what I'm doing. So it will be a long stream. You need to have patience. You need to wait. We'll take a couple of breaks, and that's the only thing that I can do. But expecting that I can answer each and every question of yours and do all the topics again, that is not possible. Case study is probably going to be macro. See, no one knows. So the probability that whether the case study will be macro or will it be micro is, people, see, our job is not to tell you that what can come or what will come, because anything can come. And I would recommend you, it's a very high recommendation to you guys, that please do not blindly follow. I mean, I never give out expected or guess topics, because I don't believe in them, because anything can come. And when in May, June, and October, November, circular flow of income question came, no one was expecting that, because CIs didn't really have a trend of giving circular flow. October, November 24 May, they ended up giving a question on the marginal and the average rate of tax. No one was expecting it, but they gave it, and it just freaked the hell out of everyone. So, I mean, blindly relying on these topics, what is going to come tomorrow. See, your job is not to predict what is going to come tomorrow. ये कौन लोग करते हैं? I mean, people जिनकी तैयारी नहीं होती ना, उनको ज़्यादा टेंशन होती है कल क्या आएगा पेपर में. You don't need to worry about what's going to come. If you are well prepared, you will be able to take on any challenges. Your job is to cover and revise everything. And if I were you, I would have never blindly trusted on expected or guess topics, right? Because anything can come tomorrow. Anything can happen tomorrow. Maybe the paper just comes on topics that you weren't really expecting. Maybe it comes on topics that you were expecting. But it's not a risk worth taking that I only do a day before the exam. I only do those topics that someone has said would definitely come. But my advice to my students is that never believe 100% blindly trust expected topics. And also, can you please go through how to calculate Iman says, can you go through how to calculate inflation? See, going through how to calculate inflation means me wasting time. Because why? Because there's already a YouTube video of 12-15 minutes on my channel on how inflation is calculated. You can go through that and you can save our time, because I can use this time for other things. How much should we give to 12 mark answer? Again, you guys are asking me questions जो हमने already final framework में discuss किए हैं. So if possible, can you give real world examples regarding the topics you discuss side by side we could use in evaluations? Yes, this is a good question. I will. देखिए, inflation के जब आप बात करें ना, खास तौर पे when you're attempting a question on inflation, so we know that demand for inflation isn't really harmful unless and until it just results into unsustainable levels of inflation, which is unsustainably high, and the economy is operating beyond full employment, overheating its existing factors of production. So it's basically living in a bubble where prices are rising, but real GDP isn't really rising. So if that's the case, and your economy is the level of unemployment is unsustainably low, because when inflation is massively high, the economy is the unemployment is unsustainably low. Unsustainably low means that your cyclical demand deficit, your unemployment is below your natural rate of unemployment. So if your unemployment is massively below the natural rate of unemployment, that's unsustainable. The economy can't really sustain it. And so what the thing that you need to talk about is, as far as cost push inflation is concerned, two examples are the Russia and the Ukraine war that you can end up giving, that how Russia and Ukraine war resulted into supply chain disruptions, and that caused cost push inflation throughout the world, because they are major exporters of oil, and that war caused disruptions in the global supply of oil, which is a major raw material, causing cost push inflation throughout the world. So the world witnessed cost push inflationary pressures. And do remember that if I import oil from either of those two countries, and I end up producing something, and then I end up exporting that product to some other country, so my input from another country means that I will end up producing a product at a very high cost, and I will sell it at a very high price, which also means that the other country, my output could be someone else's input, and that's how the ripple effect of cost push inflation spreads globally throughout the world. Okay. Got it, guys? Russia-Ukraine war is a very good example that you could give. Also, you could talk about Pakistan. That Pakistan mein inflation in 2023 to 2024 exceeded 30%. That's again because of two reasons. Firstly, the Russia-Ukraine war. Secondly, our currency was highly weak, very weak against the US dollar. So that was resulting into imported inflation. देखें, आपको इस बात को, ये कोई एक स्टूडेंट है, पाक 3+ इनका नाम है. This gentleman is saying that in hyperinflation, आपको मेरी बात सुने आप. Hyperinflation दुनिया में 2-3 कंट्रीज़ में, 4 कंट्रीज़ में, वेनेजुएला, जिम्बाब्वे, की एग्जांपल आप दे सकते हैं. आपको पता है what exactly is hyperinflation? When does hyperinflation occurs? What is exactly the definition of hyperinflation? क्या definition होती है hyperinflation की? What do you think exactly is hyperinflation? जी. Rate is more than 50. So exactly, hyperinflation is when the economy is suffering from inflation which is higher than 50%, not annual, per month. It's per month, right? So the inflation is more than 50% per month. It's not higher than 50% annual. हम जब inflation calculate करते हैं तो हम annual rate calculate करते हैं. But inflation 50% per month से बढ़ रही है. That is what hyperinflation is. When we were saying नहीं, inflation is too high, नहीं, ये गलत है जुमला. Inflation is too high. How much is it too high? Economists have given a specific measure about hyperinflation, and that is when the inflation is rising 50% per month. और मैंने अपनी streams में पहले भी I explained this point. Okay, guys, moving forward, let's not get distracted. So I said I was talking about domestic goods becoming sort of expensive when inflation occurs, and what that does is that exports become less competitive because of inflation, and export revenues fall, and that causes the trade deficit to widen, because domestic inflation means that your local goods would become expensive compared to foreign goods, and that means exporters would lose their price advantage that they once had, making their products less attractive abroad, and this leads to a decline in your export revenue, especially for those exports which have especially in price elastic markets. At the same time, imports become artificially cheaper, and imports may continue. Imports technically become relatively cheaper because of inflation in the domestic economy, because inflation would mean that people would. So there are two reasons why imports rise. ये भी सवाल case study में आ चुका है. Multiple times they have asked question in the case study 6 markers में that why were imports really rising. So generally inflation results into rise in imports for two reasons. Firstly, because if inflation is occurring due to a very high levels of aggregate demand, strong domestic demand. So strong domestic demand would mean that people would also import more, right? Also, inflation means your local goods become expensive, so people would relatively buy foreign goods. So these are two reasons why imports, right? Also, inflation erodes the value of savings, and the reason is that real interest rates could be very low, or they may even be negative, and savers would then lose purchasing power, and it would mean that it would lower the incentive to sort of save. So with high inflation, the real returns on savings are very, very low, because real interest rate is simply nominal interest rate minus inflation. So savers would lose purchasing power, reducing the incentive to save. And that's when saving reduces, savers ke liye, it reduces the real returns. And what then savers do is that savers may shift behavior towards, look for other sort of investments, temporary investments. And this is another reason why shoe leather cost occurs. This is also another reason why your redistribution of incomes occur as well. Okay. Okay, moving forward, let's move on to what deflation is. A question occurs that is it not necessary to give real life examples, right? No, it is not an absolute necessity that you need to give a real life example, because you have to understand that in tomorrow's paper you will not really have a lot of time. So let's be very practical and let's be very honest. And the brutal reality is that in tomorrow's paper you will not have a lot of time. And there's another brutal reality that a lot of you people will end up not being able to finish the paper unless and until you use the tips that I will teach you today, because you will not be able to finish the paper tomorrow. That's for a fact, because let's be very honest, finishing the paper, if 10 students are giving the paper, 5 of them will not be able to finish the entire paper, or they will end up writing short. The last answer will be very short. So you have to have a certain time management in front of you. Only then you will be able to finish the paper. Otherwise you will not be able to finish the paper tomorrow. And I need to, in today's stream, I will be teaching you those things as well. Inflation. So also remember that real life example is not a perfect substitute for it's not a perfect substitute for a good chain of analysis. So if your chain of analysis is weak and you think that I'm going to be making a lot of diagrams to sort of impress the examiner, examiner is not impressed by diagrams, because they're impressed by chain of analysis, and just drawing out diagrams just to bombard the exam sheet with diagrams with no meaning and no reference and nothing to do with, just drawn there. The diagram is just lying there. It's just literally lying there like a loner with no significance and importance. So no marks, 0 marks for all of this crap. Also, like I said, giving real life examples is not a perfect substitute for weak chain of analysis. I don't think the stream is lagging. There is some problem at your end. Guys, is the stream lagging? I don't think it is lagging. Okay, now let's start with deflation, and which is our second map. And deflation, you guys know what deflation is. Deflation is simply a fall in prices, and it could be good or bad, because deflation, and whether it's good or bad, depends upon the cause of deflation, rate of deflation. Evaluation mein likhna hoga in the conclusion as well. So deflation could occur because of a persistent decline in AD, and a good diagram to make for deflation is a Keynesian aggregate supply curve, where you shift AD to the left and bring the economy's sort of full equilibrium on the horizontal Keynesian range. Anyways, what deflation does is that deflation reduces consumer spending, and consumers, the problem with deflation is that deflation, and this is where deflation actually becomes really bad. This is where deflation gets worse. And that is because, you see, if deflation starts to occur, there's a role of expectations that kick in. Because consumers would notice a trend that prices are falling, and they would anticipate even lower prices in the future, which means that they would delay the spending. They would delay spending on especially big items like cars or appliances, because they would hope to buy them when the prices fall further later on. And they're sort of postponing the consumption, and the postponement of consumption would slow down consumption further, reducing AD further, which means that it would just further result into a deflation. So deflation further brings in more deflation, especially when, because of the role of expectations, that people have an expectation that prices will fall further. So this is when this is where a deflation sort of converts into a recession. So बहुत सारे students, what they do is that they immediately say that deflation means a recession, while it's not, because a deflation could be also be occurring because of a small slowdown. It's a temporary deflationary effect, maybe because maybe because of a currency. Maybe because of a currency appreciation, and a currency appreciation could mean lower exports, which could also be another reason why AD is falling and that deflation is occurring. But that's temporary. Probably exports will go back up again later on for various reasons, and that could settle the deflationary effects. Just don't immediately jump onto the word recession, because recession is not a small thing. It's only when the deflation becomes really embedded and it really becomes the deflation becomes persistent is when we say that it's a recession. So aggregate demand goes down when economic growth starts to slow down, and when the slowdown starts to happen, then you have a risk of recession. And when economic growth reduces is when your recession sort of starts to happen. And when you talk about recessions, what you need to talk about is that consumers and businesses spend less because aggregate demand would fall, and firms would respond by reducing production levels, and because of lower sales happening, and GDP growth slows down and it contracts ultimately. And if this is just prolonged, if this just keeps on happening, it can actually, the deflation or the initial slowdowns can push the economy into a recession. And recession is a sustained period of negative or stagnant growth, because it's a consecutive, for 2 consecutive quarters. That's what recession is. Also, recession means that prices and wages would fall, but the debt would stay the same. So the real value of debt would rise. Why? Because the real burden of fixed debt would increase. Simply because if, let's say, Mr. A takes a 1 million loan when the prices were very, very high, but now feels, but now repaying that a million rupees feels very heavier, and he feels really sad and bad about it because his earnings have fallen. Probably he's even jobless because of that recession. And so so debt servicing का जो burden होता है, debt servicing burden, especially for households and firms, starts to increase. And as a result, they must end up reducing their what they do is that they end up reducing their they then probably end up reducing their consumptions and some from somewhere else in order to make sure that they have the available income to repay back the debt. So the real debt servicing burdens go up, and that's not good. Also, do remember, guys, do remember. So deflation, Shafat Afridi says, sir, deflation benefits the lender. You can say it benefits the lender, but benefiting the lender in real terms, not really, he doesn't get extra cash for it. It's just that in real terms, he feels benefited. But it's not something, he feels that. Okay, fine, theek hai. He feels benefited, yeah. Theek hai. Also remember that deflation means revenues would fall for firms. They would end up with lower profits, and what would happen is that firms would end up with lower profits, which means that they need to now kick off some of the workers. They would cut costs to maintain their profit margins, and that would result in layoffs, because they would either cut wages for some of the workers, or they would just lay off many of the workers, and that would cause unemployment to go up, because to maintain the profitability they need to resort to cost cutting, right? And there are 2 ways to cut cost. What are those 2 ways? Either the workers could, either the firms could cut down wages to cut cost, or they could just kick off the workers. The problem is that reducing wages isn't really easy. Like, I hold a meeting with my workers and say, you know what, from tomorrow onwards, we are cutting your 20% salary. That would cause backlash. So probably with, laying off the workers is something that, because there's resistance to wage cuts. Okay. So this results into higher demand deficit, cyclical unemployment. Recessions and cyclical unemployment go side by side, especially when those recessions are from the demand side. And cyclical unemployment means people are more jobless, and now that would further reduce disposable incomes in the economy, and this would worsen the deflationary spiral or the existing recession, and that's when the recessions become a worsening problem. वही वाली बात कि incomes गिर रही हैं, people are getting jobless, even firms are facing with lower profits because firms are also getting lower prices. Now deflation आ रही है, prices are falling, and employers need to then figure out a way to maintain profits. They either need to cut wages or just kick off some of the workers. And so either the wages are cut, which is rarely going to happen because there's a lot of resistance in downward wage spend cutting, or they would be made jobless, and the fact that they would be ultimately made jobless would mean that their incomes would go down, which would that would mean even less spending, which would lead to further fall in AD. So it's a deflationary spiral. So spending is going down, incomes are going down, prices are going down. So deflationary spiral. And the problem with deflationary spiral is that deflationary spirals are very difficult to reverse. That's a problem. So deflation में what really happens is that consumers so ये हो गया, ठीक है. दूसरा deflation में what consumers do is that consumers prioritize saving because consumers also postpone spending, so they save more. So saving more just worsens the deflation. ठीक है, saving more just worsens the deflation, and it just forces firms' revenues to fall further because no one is spending when they're saving. So it just worsens problems in the economy. Also, do remember that when deflation occurs or there's a recession, it also leads to lower tax revenues for the government. Because income tax revenues are falling because of higher unemployment means lower income tax revenues. Also, since spending is falling and saving is going up in a recession, the revenues from VAT, that is value added tax, that is also going down because of lower spending. While at the same time, automatically government spending increases. Government spending increases because of unemployment benefits. Because you need to understand that some of the government spends on unemployment benefits, that is welfare payments, and some of the welfare payments act as automatic stabilizers, which means that if you're unemployed, right, you automatically become eligible to that unemployment benefit. So the government hasn't really announced that it would end up giving more unemployment benefits. It's just that more people are now eligible for those unemployment benefits. So the government spending is automatically rising. It's not that the government has said that from tomorrow onwards, we're going to be increasing the unemployment benefits by 10% or 15%. It's just happening automatically. There's a whole great system or the mechanism in place where you're unemployed and now you automatically become eligible. So government spending rises while tax revenues fall, so it results into a budget deficit. So the problem with deflation is that it creates a budget deficit, and a budget deficit is a problem because a budget deficit would worsen the government's fiscal position. ये लिखना है आपको. Budget deficit worsens government's fiscal position. Budget deficit itself, if you say it results in a budget deficit, so what? So what's the big deal? It would worsen the fiscal position because if you have a budget deficit, then ultimately you would resort to borrowing, and that would increase your debt levels and all of that. So deflation slows down economy, it leads to economic contraction, it leads to rising unemployment, higher debt burdens, falling spending, weaker government finances because government is spending more while tax revenues are going down, and all of these things combine, and then you have a budget deficit, The problem is that ये जो budget deficit है, because of higher government spending, because you see government की spending is automatically going up on unemployment benefits. At the same time, tax revenues are falling. So a lot of government's money is being diverted on unproductive uses. Spending on welfare payments and transfer payments isn't really a productive use, right, of money. Instead, they should spend that money on education, healthcare, infrastructure, educational reforms, try to reduce structural unemployment, come up with supply side policies. So वो unproductive uses पे spend हो रहा होता है, which sort of is not good for the long term economic recovery. वो इससे economic recovery slow down हो रही होती है आपकी. So मतलब sustain long term economic recovery slows down because you aren't really investing in productive projects, just like I mentioned, right? So moving forward, unemployment की हम बात कर लेते हैं. Now we move on to the chapter of unemployment. And जहाँ तक unemployment की बात है, contractionary monetary policy can cause deflationary pressures. You have to understand that जब आप deflation की बात करें, so to what extent are you talking about a deflation? As in, are you just talking about a temporary deflation, or a deflation that happens in a recession, or a deflation that happens in an economic slowdown? What is the extent of that deflation? So you need to be very much clear about it, that what context are you talking about when you're talking about a deflation. But yes, contractionary monetary policy will result into deflationary pressures. But you see, when the central bank implements a contractionary monetary policy, the central bank doesn't really cares about deflation, because contractionary monetary policies are implemented when the inflation levels are very, very high, because the central bank wants to ensure price stability. So even if the trade-off is that there is deflation, they'll accept it. They'll accept that trade-off. So, got it? Now, coming to unemployment, you guys know what unemployment is, and what are the types of unemployment: your frictional, structural, cyclical. ये सब आपको पता होनी चाहिए. I mean, you must be very much knowing that what are the reasons for these unemployments and what are the types. Even you must be knowing that what sort of unemployment is really bad for the economy, whether structural is more harmful or frictional is more harmful, because those sort of questions do come in the exam. And in all our previous live streams, I mean, I've done a lot of live streams in this month for AS, and I've covered such questions as well. You can go through my live streams tonight if you guys plan. Although I wouldn't really recommend you to binge to be up all night, because tomorrow you have an AM exam. Anyways, coming back, unemployment rises. So unemployment would mean that it would cause a loss of incomes and lower standard of living. When individuals would lose their jobs, it would mean that they would lose their regular incomes, because they are losing their regular incomes. Whatever income they had, they're now losing that. So initially I had a regular income stream for 5-10 years, but now I lost it. So the only income I have right now is the unemployment benefits that I'm getting from the government, right? So with very limited incomes or no incomes at all, people will struggle to afford even the basic necessities. So it may lower living standards. And you can also mention about poverty, that poverty levels would go up. It would just result into a material standard of living to decline. So poverty levels would go up, mental stress and well-being would be affected, poverty levels would rise, and you can talk about that. Also, unemployment, when jab rise hoti hai, that sort of causes reduced consumer spending because of lower demand, and firms also end up earning less revenues. So aggregate demand falls. That is again a recessionary thing, and sales would go down, profits would go down, firms would invest less then, because it would translate into, so that would, when AD starts falling, it causes slowdowns. Ultimately, when AD keeps on falling, it causes a recession. And when the recession worsens itself, it causes a trough or a slump or an economic depression, right? So firms would cut back. It would result into cyclical unemployment, because firms would cut back on jobs. It would result in demand deficit, cyclical unemployment. And also, because unemployment is associated, especially demand deficit unemployment is associated with recessions coming from the demand side, it results into business pessimism, and businesses are not really confident about the future of the economy. So they would halt or stop their planned future investments. So investments would fall, which will have a negative effect on the long run aggregate supply of the economy. Also, unemployment जब rise हो रही होती है, so government, unemployment is rising, government needs to pay more in economic unemployment benefits. So governments have to spend more on unemployment benefits, such as social welfare programs, you know, your educational allowances or your food safety allowances and all of those things. And this just increases public expenditure, and it puts a lot of pressure on the fiscal budget. It puts a lot of pressure on the government's public finances. It puts a lot of pressure on your national budgets. And at the same time, because of recessions, untaxed revenues are falling, so just budget deficit widens. And this point we also discussed in the previous slide as well. Also, rising unemployment, like I said, falling government revenue. Government isme do mention about why tax revenues. So don't just say tax revenues falling, talk about why they are falling. Income tax collections decline, indirect tax revenues like VAT or sales tax collection declines because of lower consumer spending. And this leads to lower overall government revenue, and it also limits the ability of the government to actually fund key services like education, healthcare, or infrastructure. Also, guys, do remember that Prashant says, can we mention automatic stabilizers? Yes, you can. Samra says, why are taxes falling? Taxes are falling because tax revenues are falling because of recessions. That corporate tax revenue is falling, sales tax revenue is falling because of lower spending, and income tax revenue is falling because people are jobless. So these are the reasons why. Also, do remember that short-term unemployment can easily be converted into long-term unemployment. That's again an evaluation that could lead to a conclusion that whether unemployment is good or bad depends upon whether that short-term unemployment translates into long-term unemployment. Because, if individuals are unemployed for a long period of time and the government hasn't really been doing a good job in expansionary demand-side policies, or the government isn't really doing a good job in addressing the root cause of the unemployment, especially if the root cause is demand deficit unemployment because of a recession. So the government should implement expansionary fiscal policy. Fiscal stimulus inject kare economy mein. But if the government inject fiscal stimulus in the economy, but if the government is coming up with supply side policies to cure demand deficit unemployment, that's not going to work in the short term. So that unemployment will persist, and because supply side policies are important for structural unemployment, not not for your cyclical unemployment. And not all supply side policies address structural unemployment. Only those supply side policies that improve labor market flexibility, that work on the education and the skills and the productivity of the workers, only those supply side policies can actually cause a reduction in structural unemployment. So don't just go on saying, supply side policies are important for unemployment, without saying what sort of supply side policy you're talking about. Not all. So building a dam or a road or street lights, these are also supply side policies, right? Building a road is also supply side policy. But is that going to reduce structural unemployment? No. So do mention what sort of supply side policies. So again, point is that if individuals are unemployed for a long period of time, they may lose out their skills. Their skills may become outdated. They may become technologically outdated as well, so their labor immobility will increase, and this reduces their employability in the future, resulting into lower overall productivity levels in the economy. And do remember that if you have less skilled workforce, that would have an impact on the level of your international competitiveness as well, because if you have a lower skilled workforce, it means that it will ultimately translate into or spill over into your goods being less competitive. Obviously, countries like, we know that countries like China has or the US has a skilled workforce, and their exports are competitive. So definitely our exports are less competitive because we do not have a skilled workforce. So that is again a problem. Okay, and so again unemployment like I said, could have an impact on businesses not investing more money because they're losing business confidence, so they would not invest and they would cut back on investments. So again, that would, just worsen the period of recessions and all of that. So now, moving on to the next slide, we have economic growth here, and you guys know what economic growth is, and what economic growth, what sort of problems, what sort of benefits economic growth has, but is economic growth always beneficial or not? We need to see. Sir, can you explain the difficulties in measuring unemployment? Benefits of these, do you have to analyze an evaluation? Do we have to, first of all, sir, do you have any other model answers? I have a lot of model answers, dude. You have no idea how many model answers have I given to my students in my course. I don't know, 50 plus model answers, and 60 plus model answers we have given in our to our registered students in AS or A2. So you have no idea how many model answers we have. That's all that we have. That's all that we do all day. Sir, should government try to balance budget or try to get a budget surplus? This is a good question. This is a very good question. इस पे I think October 2023 पे question भी आया है इस पे. देख लेंगे, we'll discuss that. देखें, budget balance पे तो आप ना जाएं, because budget balance having either you should go for a budget deficit or budget surplus. Budget balance अगर आप अपने excessive deficits को maintain कर रहे हैं, या आप ये समझ लें कि आप बजट डेफिसिट पे जा रहे हैं ड्यूरिंग टाइम्स ऑफ व्हेन रिक्वायर्ड, such as implementing an expansionary policy when required, so it will end up with a budget deficit, and you're going for budget surplus, which is technically fiscal austerity during times when you want to reduce your debt levels and you want to reduce spending in the economy. Ultimately आपकी इकोनॉमी में रीबैलेंसिंग हो जाएगी एंड यू विल इन द लॉन्ग टर्म एंड अप विद अ बजट बैलेंस. नाउ ये मैकेनिज्म समझाना इस वक्त तो आउट ऑफ कॉन्टेक्स्ट हो जाएगी बात, बट दैट्स व्हाट इट इज. सो it neither go for, so again you should ideally aim for a budget deficit during times when your economy is suffering from a deep recession. You should go for a balance. You should go for a budget surplus when your economy needs fiscal austerity, when your economy is already suffering from huge levels of public debt or national debt. When it wants to reduce those debt levels, it should then go for budget surplus. And ultimately, if you go for budget surplus when required or budget deficits when required, economy in the long term will end up having a balanced budget, or the economy would be rebalanced in the long run. So that's what it is basically. इसका जो final conclusion है वो यही है कि a government should implement its budgetary policies based on the economic cycles. Budget deficit might be beneficial if it's due to expansionary fiscal policy to boost growth. Yeah. So government enacts a budget deficit. It says, okay, fine, this time we need to go for a budget deficit because we need to come up with expansionary policies, expansionary demand side policies. What factors do we have to discuss in evaluation? बेटा वो आपने मेरी लाइफ वो फाइनल फ्रेमवर्क अटेंड नहीं किया था या देखा नहीं है, आप उसको जाके देखें, उसमें आपको एवेल्यूएशन की बहुत चीज़ें मिल जाएंगी. अब एग्ज़ाम से पहले अगर कोई ये स्टूडेंट पूछ रहा है कि मुझे एवेल्यूएशन में क्या डिस्कस करना होता है, तो मतलब उसकी क्या हालत होगी कल के एग्ज़ाम के लिए. मतलब क्या बोल सकता हूँ मैं आपको, आप जाके वो देख लें, उसमें फाइनल फ्रेमवर्क के अंदर वो सारी चीज़ें हैं. Sir, claimant count and labor force survey were niche topics tested by the examiner. देखिए, एक स्टूडेंट ने सवाल पूछा है, सवाल तो नहीं, उन्होंने कहा ये नीच टॉपिक्स थे. ये नीच टॉपिक्स नहीं थे, ये आपको लगता है कि नीच टॉपिक्स थे बिकॉज आपने अपने आप को फिक्सेट किया हुआ था कि एक सर्टन पैटर्न होता है. ये कोई नीश टॉपिक्स नहीं है. एग्जामिनर्स जब पेपर बना रहे होते हैं तो उनको कोई ये नहीं होता कि ये टॉपिक है, ये टॉपिक नहीं है. वो क्या करते हैं, वो कंसिस्टेंटली 2-3 तरह सालों में एक तरह का टॉपिक टेस्ट हो रहे होते हैं, फिर वो एकदम से कोई ऐसे टॉपिक्स दे देते हैं जो उन्होंने टॉपिक पहले टेस्ट नहीं किए. तो लेबर फोर्स सर्वे हो गया, मार्जिनल एवरेज रेट ऑफ टैक्स हो गया, जीनी कोएफिशिएंट हो गया, उन्होंने टेस्ट कर लिया आपसे. वो तो आपको लग रहा है कि नीश है, तो आपको क्यों लग रहा है कि वो नीश टॉपिक्स है? आपने क्यों सोचा? वाई डिड यू एंड अप thinking that these are niche topics, they cannot come? It's your problem. It's a you problem. It's not their problem to give these topics they are mentioned in the syllabus. They can give anything. You predicted this, this cannot come. So the point is that anything can happen tomorrow, anything can come tomorrow. So please don't fixate yourself into thinking, because when you go up fixating yourself in the exam tomorrow, you go tomorrow in the exam thinking that, you know what, a question on economic growth or inflation can come, or the second question could be on policies, or I don't know, whatever, but that doesn't really happen, and this will then freak you out. So you shouldn't have any expectation for tomorrow's. Anything can happen, just ये ज़हन में रखना. Got it? Economic growth की बात करते हैं. Is long-term growth only caused due to a shift in LRAS or AD as well? एग्रीगेट डिमांड के बढ़ने से आपकी शॉर्ट टर्म ग्रोथ या एक्चुअल ग्रोथ आती है, और एक्चुअल ग्रोथ हैपन्स फॉर आइदर इंक्रीज इन एडी और इंक्रीज इन शॉर्ट टर्म एग्रीगेट सप्लाई, एंड LRAS is basically your potential growth. So long term growth is your sustainable growth or a potential growth that we're talking about, and that happens due to a rise in your productive capacity or LRAS. Now moving forward, इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ के बहुत सारे एडवांटेजेस भी हैं और कुछ डिसएडवांटेजेस भी हैं. सो इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ जो है, that results into, economic growth is simply a rise in real GDP. There's two types of growth: actual growth, potential growth. Actual growth happens because of a rise in AD or a rise in SRAS. Potential growth happens because of a rise in LRAS, because of supply side policies, long-term supply side policies. It could be modeled through a shift in LRAS to the right, or it could be modeled through a shift in PPC to the right as well. तो हमें पता है that when economic growth happens and output rises, businesses earn higher revenues, higher wages, higher profits, higher standard of living, better nutrition, more housing, more education, more healthcare, all of these. So consumer welfare goes up, society's welfare goes up, people have access to better education, healthcare, access to better leisure, access to better nutrition, access to better housing. The second thing that we need to know is that economic growth results in higher employment opportunities, and it results into lower unemployment. So because economic growth में अगर if the economic growth is rising due to a rise in aggregate demand in the economy, so when firms, देखिए मैं आपको एक बहुत important चीज़ बता दूँ. मैं आज एक मिथ ब्रेक करना चाहता हूँ. आज लाइव स्ट्रीम है और मैं ये बात लाइव बोल रहा हूँ. एक मिथ है बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट. आप ये आई डोंट नो कि इस वक्त लाइव स्ट्रीम में कितने मिनट्स और कितने सेकंड्स हो गए हैं. आप ये जो नहीं है, आप अपने फ्रेंड्स को ये बात ऑन रिकॉर्ड शेयर कर दीजिएगा कि कल AS का पेपर है. और मैं आपको फिर एक बात बता दूं कि बच्चों का फोकस होगा एग्रीगेट डिमांड के डायग्राम्स बना के आ जाएं, LRAS को शिफ्ट करके दिखा के आ जाएं, और PPC को ऐसे आउटवर्ड दिखाएं कि बस कोई क़यामत बर्पा हो गई हो, या कोई आसमान से जो है वो कोई बारिश बरस गई हो. मतलब इतने डायग्राम्स को लेकर स्टूडेंट्स इतने ज़्यादा जो हैं वो उसको ग्रेटिफाई करते हैं. और डायग्राम्स बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट होते हैं, लेकिन डायग्राम्स परफेक्ट सब्स्टिट्यूट नहीं होते. अगर आप इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ में, लेट्स सपोज यू आर अटेम्प्टिंग अ क्वेश्चन ऑन इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ, एंड व्हाट यू डू इज दैट यू मेक एन ADAS डायग्राम, एंड लेट्स से यू मेक एन ADAS डायग्राम. अब आपने ADAS डायग्राम बना दिया आपने कहा इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ आ रही है, या फिर आपने जो है वो इसकी जगह क्या बनाया, you ended up making this Keynesian aggregate demand curve and you said कि economic growth आ रही है, या फिर you ended up shifting the LRAS to the right. But the point is, my point what I'm trying to explain to you guys is that you have to understand that even if you make these three diagrams have no significance unless and until you can't really translate, or you can't really explain. You are not able to explain. समझाना है, बताना नहीं है. समझाना है, बाकायदा समझाना है. कॉज इफेक्ट कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस के ज़रिए समझाना है, बताना नहीं है. समझाना है. अगर आप नहीं समझा पाए नहीं समझा पाए एग्जामिनर को दैट वाई इज एग्जैक्टली इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ बेनिफिशियल. सो नो वन रियली केयर्स अबाउट योर डायग्राम्स यार, अनलेस एंड अनटिल उन्होंने आपसे स्पेसिफिकली डायग्राम मांगा है फिर तो बहुत ही ज़रूरी है. लेकिन अगर आप डायग्राम आपसे नहीं मांगा, दे हैवंट रियली आस्क्ड अ डायग्राम, and you end up making a diagram without really being able to explain how economic growth is really beneficial, you will not get the required marks no matter how many good diagrams you end up making. So what it follows is that yes, diagrams are very, very important, but what's more important is the fact that your analysis and your evaluation should be perfect. You must be able to explain and express what you're trying to say. Making super duper great diagrams without really explaining won't end up you anywhere. And that is exactly the reason why the thresholds are so low. I mean, if you look at the thresholds, I've been screaming this throughout the year that the reason why thresholds are so low because students pathetically perform the paper. They know a lot, but knowing something and being able to attempt it in a way that you will end up scoring well, these are two different things. So you might know a lot, but you don't really know the tips and the tricks and the strategies to use in the exam. So you will end up nowhere. Literally, you will end up nowhere. Even if your economics is like, I don't know, equivalent to what Adam Smith's economics was. So again, call it. सबको ये बात समझ में आ गई है. Moving forward, we were talking about economic growth. So economic growth will also result into higher employment opportunities, lower unemployment. Cyclical unemployment falls because of economic growth. And as demand, अब देखें अगर आप ये explain, if you're writing in the exam that cyclical unemployment falls, so again ये आपने समझाया नहीं है, ये बताया है. अब बताने की कोई importance नहीं है. Cause, effect, consequence. इसकी analysis क्या होगी? That you will say that as demand expands, firms expand production because of a rise in AD, creating greater need for workers, which reduces cyclical unemployment. And then you will say that also what really happens is that, you know, job creation हो रही है, firms, people are getting employed, it boosts household incomes and it improves consumer confidence in the economy. And the fact that household incomes are rising, when you need to understand that workers are workers in the morning, but they're consumers in the evening. So they end up spending back on the economy. So household incomes rise and workers spend back. So because workers are workers in the morning, but they're consumers in the evening. So consumer confidence is rising. And that just reinforces the growth cycle. It reinforces the growth cycle. And employment is very important because it promotes social stability and it reduces poverty levels in the economy. Moving forward, moving forward, also remember that higher economic growth means higher tax revenues, better government finances. So government's fiscal space बढ़ जाती है. Government has more room to spend, more room to invest in public goods, infrastructure, education, healthcare. It improves the productive capacity of the economy because government could, and this will actually lead to long-term sustainable economic growth. LRA shifts to the right. And it enhances productive capacity of the economy. And yeah, ठीक है, potential GDP आपकी बढ़ जाती है, and the government could end up also improving public services in the economy. So economic growth also results into increased investments. And what happens is that when economic growth is happening, that sort of sends a signal in the economy that, so if economic growth is happening in the economy, it sends signals throughout the economy, as well as it sends signal to international investors as well that the economy is doing well. And domestic firms, while international firms would invest in the economy, they would invest in capital, technology, R&D. And technology, R&D, and all of this, and capital expenditures, they improve labor productivity. They have a very direct impact on labor productivity. Not only labor productivity, but the overall efficiency of the businesses and the overall efficiency of the economy as well. And this is very helpful for the long-term competitiveness of the economy. So exports will rise as well. So there's a lot of export-related side that you need to explore in your essay as well, talking about economic growth. ठीक है. और मैंने जहाँ तक उसकी बात मैंने ऑलरेडी कर ली थी कि it sort of reduces poverty levels and all of that. And growth results into economic growth जब आती है तो when the government is getting more tax revenues, they would invest in infrastructure projects, roads, power grids, internet, schools. Better infrastructure से क्या होगा, आपके logistics improve होंगे, transport improve होगी, तो ट्रांसपोर्ट कॉस्ट कम होगी, आपके गुड्स कंपेरेटिव होंगे, योर एक्सपोर्ट्स विल राइज, एंड अगेन लॉन्ग टर्म कंपेरेटिव. मैं आपसे वही कह रहा हूँ कि इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ को किसी ना किसी तरह 2-3 मल्टीपल वेज से आप कनेक्ट करें, हाउ इट कुड ट्रांसलेट इनटू हायर एक्सपोर्ट रेवेन्यूज़. But economic growth is not all beneficial. So it's not all sweet as it sounds. And just because economic growth has a lot of benefits doesn't mean that economic growth comes without its limitations. So so ab yahan pe your evaluation, when you're counter arguing, and you are sort of explaining how economic growth could be could result into various limitations. For instance, environmental degradation, right? So excessive economic growth could lead to overuse of natural resources, and it could result in deforestation, air and water pollution, contributing to climate change. And this would undermine sustainable growth, because you see, you have to understand when economic growth is concerned, when your economic growth is concerned, what happens is that economic growth का में हमारा objective होता है sustainable growth. Sustained and sustainable growth. And sustainable growth is growth without inflationary pressures and without negative externalities. So if there's a lot of economic growth but at the expense of high inflation or negative externalities, then that economic growth wouldn't really translate into higher economic welfare. ठीक है. So growth results into widening of income inequality, and growth does not always benefits everyone. Remember that growth का सबसे बड़ा मसला ये है कि it widens your income inequality as well, because growth doesn't really benefits everyone equally. High income individuals will often gain more from economic growth because, when the economy grows, people have a lot of assets, people might possess a lot of wealth, and the value of the wealth will increase, and they would get richer. And low skilled or rural workers may benefit less because they don't really possess a lot of wealth. Neither, low skilled workers like, let's say, miners, farmers, fishermen, people who are driving these taxis and these cabs, growth in sectors से तो नहीं आ रही ना. growth आ रही है tertiary sector से, service sector से, tourism से, textile से. So if growth is concentrated in specific industries, or it is coming from specific industries, so that growth is first of all not inclusive, and it will just widen income inequality, and that's a very big problem, major problem of growth. So where we say economic growth isn't really doing any help to the economy, and this just widens income inequality, and it leads to relative poverty. It leads to social resentments. It just leads to political unrest, because on paper you're growing, but then your poverty isn't really reducing. So what's the point? Growth, मैंने आपको पहले बताया that growth may result into resource depletion, and that's not good, and that's not good for the future generations as well. Also, another problem with economic growth is that economic growth might result into demand pull inflation, and demand pull inflation is when there is a lot of excess demand in the economy that your firms can't really satisfy because they are suffering from input bottlenecks, and they can't really do anything about that demand, and so that puts an upward pressure on prices. And if it can create a bad or an undesirable inflationary environment for the economy, where अभी देखें, ये जो मैं वर्ड यूज़ कर रहा हूँ अनडिज़ायरेबल इन्फ्लेशन, ये सीखें इसको, ये तो सीखना होता है, ये तो पूरे साल सीखना था आपने. अनडिज़ायरेबल इन्फ्लेशनरी इन्वायरमेंट्स क्रिएट होंगे ग्रोथ की वजह से. ये तरीका होता है बोलने के, एक्सप्रेस करने के hundreds ऑफ तरीके होते हैं. एटलीस्ट आप 10-12 तो सीख लें. So it results into undesirable inflationary environments in the economy, and then it sort of necessitates monetary intervention. अब देखें यही फ़र्क होगा एक उस स्टूडेंट में जो A* लाएगा, एक वो स्टूडेंट जो डिस्टिंक्शन लाएगा. Like average student के वो probably student that would make sure that he gets the top marks, you would say कि भाई might result into undesirable inflationary environments which would necessitate monetary intervention by central banks. Central banks may immediately respond by raising interest rates to cool down the economy because you need to maintain price stability. But the problem with raising interest rates is that raising interest rates could be recessionary. So that itself has its own problems. So again, right? तो इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ भी हमारा यहाँ पे ख़त्म हो जाता है. बाकी अर्बनाइजेशन और ओवर क्राउडिंग का पॉइंट आई थिंक मोर और लेस वो है कि इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ जो है वो आपको पता है कि ऑफन कॉन्सेंट्रेटेड होती है सिटीज़ में, अर्बन एरियाज़ में, and that sort of attracts people from rural regions, and this causes rapid urbanization which could lead to, number one, Pakistan a problem hai in cities especially like Karachi. It's causing rapid urbanization leading to traffic congestion, polluting, housing shortages, bahut bada masla hai hamara, a lot of unnecessary undesirable pressure on infrastructure. तो क्वालिटी ऑफ लाइफ जो होती है ना वो फिर सिटीज़ में बड़ा डिक्लाइन होना शुरू हो जाती है, एंड रिक्वायर्स some sort of urban planning to deal with all of this. Anyways, let me see, you guys don't have any new questions. Anyways, moving forward, unemployment khatam ho jata, economic, this ends economic growth. Moving on to policies, we talk about expansionary fiscal policy now. Are you guys following? Are we good, guys? Are we good? Everyone good? Are we cool, like enjoying, following? समझ आ रहा है? अभी हम एक्सपेंशनरी फिस्कल पॉलिसी करेंगे, फिर प्रॉब्ली कॉन्ट्रैक्शनरी करेंगे, फिर हम मॉनेटरी करेंगे, फिर हम सप्लाई साइड करेंगे, फिर हम करंट अकाउंट और एक्सचेंज रेट्स वाला एलिमेंट देखेंगे, एंड वी आर डन विद दैट. एंड देन हमारा दैट वुड एंड आवर मैक्रो का रिविजन थरली इंशाल्लाह. उसके बाद कुछ डायग्राम्स देख लेंगे, उसके बाद हम कुछ evaluation की तुम लोग को मुझे I need to explain the tricks. So now let's do one thing. Let's sort of take a 5-10 minute break and let's be back. I think 1 घंटा हो चुका है हमें, तो a 10-minute break would be helpful for our mental sanity and for the continuity of the stream. So guys, do share this stream with your friends. Now we're going to be starting off with policies inshallah in 10 minutes. Okay, are we cool? Okay, guys, we are back. Are we ready? We are starting with expansionary fiscal policy. Now, you guys know what expansionary fiscal policy is. Expansionary fiscal policy is basically the policy that the government uses. It is the policy the government uses, and this policy is primarily used. It's a demand side policy, and it's a discretionary policy, and it's a policy that is used to stabilize the economy, especially during times of inflation, to maintain price stability during times of lower economic growth, to increase growth levels during recessions, because we need to recover from recessions. So that is when you use your fiscal policy, and when you use a fiscal policy as a discretionary, कहते हैं इसको, discretionary fiscal policy means that the government uses खुद से government implements this policy because it wants to do something. It needs to stabilize the economy. And it's a demand side policy, and the objective is to either increase or decrease aggregate demand to stabilize the economy. Got it? That's when you use. So the government either goes for a budget deficit or it goes for a budget surplus. Especially during times of very high inflation, government would enact a budget surplus. During times of a recession, the government would enact a budget deficit. So as far as expansionary fiscal policy is concerned, it deals with spending. Expansive fiscal policy is concerned, it deals with cutting taxes, increasing government spending and cutting taxes. These are two tools of fiscal policy: increasing government spending and or cutting taxes. Okay, so the government would increase government spending on government projects like infrastructure, education. Apparently, the government would inject money into the economy and could increase government expenditures on its welfare stimulus into the economy. Stimulus packages भी कहते हैं इनको. So this is how the government basically creates demand, artificially creates demand. And do remember that fiscal policy is a policy. जब आप expansionary fiscal policy की बात करें, you're attempting a question on recessions. You could talk about how John Maynard Keynes advocated the use of expansionary fiscal policy to bring the economy out of recession. Especially, you could mention the Great Depression of the 1930s, where the US unemployment rate exceeded 25%, and classical policies were failing to self-heal or self-adjust and self-heal the economy. So classical economists were miserably failing in their policies of the policies that market self-adjust. So John Maynard Keynes advocated for expansionary demand side policy, otherwise the recession won't really end. So you could talk about that. So ultimately, government spending hum badhate hain, and we sort of cut taxes, and cutting taxes would leave households with more disposable income, and this would then boost consumption and increase aggregate demand in the economy. Also higher, because when consumer spending would rise, businesses would expand because they would ultimately suddenly see a surge in more orders and sales, and in response, firms would increase output to meet rising aggregate demand, and they would hire more workers, they would buy more raw materials, and they would end up using idle resources and idle capacity and idle resources, and this would just increase aggregate demand in the economy, bringing the economy out of recession. And that's what expansionary fiscal policy is intended to do. There would be more output, higher economic growth, and there would be a movement towards full employment, because when resources, spare capacity, idle capacity would be utilized, it would bring the economy closer to full employment, right? Ultimately at full employment at one point, and that's when economic growth happens, right? Or jahan pe hum idle resources kya hai? Idle resources: unemployed labor, underused factories, unemployed labor, idle machinery. They're actually put to work. So all of these underused factories and underemployed or unemployed labor is put to work. So the economy sort of moves closer to full employment, and when the economy moves closer to full employment, it narrows the output gaps, and more jobs are created in the economy, and it reduces unemployment, especially if it's cyclical unemployment. Or government spending, maybe when the government spends, it actually especially the government funded projects on infrastructure or construction or healthcare, they directly create public sector jobs in the economy, and this also boosts aggregate demand. It encourages the private sector firms to, sort of hire more workers and hire more labor to reduce cyclical unemployment. And as job opportunities grows and as the economy begins to recover from recessions, and that stimulates AD and real GDP output, there's a multiplied rise in national income. The sort of multiplier effect kicks in, where when people start to spend and consume and spend, I mean, my spending is your income, and your spending is his income, and his spending is her income, and so that's how the multiplier effect works. It results into a multiplied rise in national income, generating further rounds of employment and output. Anyways, if you don't know what the multiplier effect is, then that's okay. AS students are not really required to know about the multiplier effect. Anyways, so higher employment, higher incomes, there's more. Also, expansionary fiscal policy results into increased consumers' confidence as well. This is another very important point. Improved consumer confidence because of more spending, because now expansive fiscal policy creates jobs, and you have more job security, and you have rising incomes, and households and individuals feel optimistic about the economy, and this boosts consumer spending. And the fact that it encourages it boosts consumer spending, and it encourages the fact that it encourages consumer spending encourages more current spending. So current consumption goes up rather than saving. So with more incomes in the economy, people start spending more rather than saving, right? Also, as businesses, because of expansionary fiscal policy, businesses are also earning more profits, because especially when expansionary fiscal policy results into a reduction in corporate taxes. So expansionary fiscal policy could result into a reduction in corporate taxes, meaning more retained profits and more retained earnings. And as businesses earn more retained earnings, it just creates a positive demand growth cycle, because higher retained profits would result in investments, and investment is a component of AD, and AD goes up, so growth happens. And when growth happens, then there's more investment by businesses, because that growth also creates a cycle of investments in the economy because of higher business confidence. So what we're talking about is a positive demand growth cycle. Then you could also talk about because of higher government spending and the fact that lower taxes, it results into a budget deficit. Now, ठीक है, we know कि budget deficit आएगा. Expansionary fiscal policy में budget deficit आएगा, and budget deficit entirely is not necessarily a problem. But if the budget deficit just balloons out of proportion and it forces the government to borrow a lot of money, and it results into very high national debt, because a budget deficit is what? Budget deficit is that the government is borrowing money to spend money. That's what a budget deficit is, because the government spending is not met by tax revenues. So the government has to borrow from somewhere to spend. So the government is borrowing funds to spend. And the government would end up borrowing money probably by selling more bonds to... If the government sells more bonds, people would buy more bonds, and that would increase national debt of the economy. And the problem with bonds is that over time, these bonds need to be serviced by interest payments. And at times, the government might borrow more just to service debt payments. And this just creates a debt trap, or a loop of debt, or debt cycle, right? Also, do remember that when the government expansionary fiscal policy का सबसे major जो disadvantage है और limitation है, वो ये है that it results into the crowding out effect. And this is a very important limitation that you need to mention about the crowding out effect, that it causes the crowding out effect, because crowding out effect is that the government borrows money from banks, and the government competes with the private sector in terms of borrowing, and that reduces the amount of funds available for the banks to lend, because now the government is competing with the private sector to borrow, because now both the private sector firms and the government is borrowing money from banks to spend. And this drives up the interest rates in the economy, and pushing up. And when interest rates go up, then private sector firms, then the investment that is done by the private sector firms goes down, because higher interest rates would reduce private sector investment. So this is the crowding out effect. that private firms may now find borrowing more expensive, and this may discourage investment, and the I component and the AD goes down. So ideally, the way you need to write this is that expansionary fiscal policy was actually meant to stimulate AD, but if expansionary fiscal policy results into the crowding out effect, it's not that the crowding out effect will always happen. Maybe the government is borrowing less funds the government is borrowing less funds, or maybe even if it's borrowing more funds, but the banks already have a lot of funds available to lend. Because government करती क्या है? Government bonds commercial banks को sell करती है, and commercial banks then buy those bonds, but they buy those bonds from the money they have as reserves that are supposed to be lent out as loans. So you have now less money to lend out, and what that does is that, like I said, that drives up the interest rates in the economy, and private sector investment goes down. So ideally, what we're saying is that expansionary fiscal policy is meant to boost AD by boosting G, the G component of AD, and the C component of AD, and also the I component of AD. But then if the crowding out effect happens, then AD is going up, but then AD is going down as well because of a fall in I, right? So this could actually render the fiscal policy ineffective. So you could mention crowding out effect in evaluation of expansionary fiscal policy, that how crowding out effect could probably render the fiscal policy not entirely ineffective, but less effective. Also, crowding out effect की जहाँ तक बात है, थोड़ा सा high level point है, but I don't know if this makes sense to you. John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian economist, used to say that you see, John Maynard Keynes was the person who was talking about fiscal policy. And he was very much into expansionary fiscal policy of लगाएं to bring the economy out of recession. But the problem with expansionary fiscal policy is it results into crowding out. जब John Maynard Keynes से argue किया गया, argument John Maynard Keynes को दी गई कि भाई fiscal policy तो crowding out effect हो जाएगा. So John Maynard Keynes said that when people argued John Maynard Keynes that fiscal policy expansionary will result into the crowding out effect. So John Maynard Keynes said that it will not result into the crowding out effect, because crowding out effect happens when the private sector firms want to borrow from banks, and banks don't have the funds to borrow, which drives up interest rates and then reduces investments. So he said that in recession, in a very, very deep recession, just like the 1930s the Great Depression. So if the economy is if the economy is going through a very deep recession, the business confidence is so low, so damn low, that businesses don't even want to invest. So let the government borrow those funds. Those funds will be idle with the banks. Businesses won't invest. So whether interest rates are low or whether interest rates are high, in a recession, business confidence and business pessimism is very, very low, and businesses are not going to invest. So probably the crowding out effect won't really happen as per Keynesians. लेकिन ये पॉइंट हर किसी के लिखने का नहीं है. खाली वो बच्चे जिनकी वोकैबुलरी बहुत स्ट्रांग है उसको पुल ऑफ कर सकते हैं, वो लिख सकते हैं. हर किसी के लिए नहीं है ये पॉइंट. Also do remember that expansionary fiscal policy results into demand for inflation. But especially expansionary fiscal policy will only result into demand for inflation if the economy is close to full employment, right? Not all rise in AD is inflationary in the economy. So not just because aggregate demand is going up doesn't really means that inflation will happen, because if your economy is in a recession and it has a lot of spare capacity, so you could make the Keynesian diagram by saying that it's not necessary that the economy would sort of go through a recession. Expansionary fiscal policy would result into inflation, especially if the economy is still away from full capacity. So this is your full capacity, right? So you still have a negative output gap. So right now there are so many unemployed resources that inflation will not happen in the economy. So also, guys, do remember one thing, that when you talk about expansionary fiscal policy, one of the disadvantages one of the limitations of expansionary fiscal policy is that expansionary fiscal policy results into economic growth, and higher economic growth means people have more incomes, and with higher disposable incomes, firms, households and firms would increase the spending on imports, and they would start importing more. So expansionary fiscal policy might stimulate AD, and it might help the economy recover from a recession. But one of the problems with expansionary fiscal policy is that expansionary fiscal policies would result into higher import spending as well, because of a rise in domestic demand in the economy. When domestic demand grows, an economy expands and people start getting richer, they would also start importing more, and that could worsen the trade deficit, especially if your economy is already suffering from a bad trade deficit on the current account, right? So trade deficit could widen, and this is really not good for a developing economy. So that's how, these are the trade-offs that governments face, and they have to come up with a middle way. And that is exactly the reason why demand side policies have to be met with supply side policies, because you see, ultimately expansionary fiscal policy would result into current account deficits, because it will result into higher import spending. So you should come up with supply side policies to make sure that your exports are competitive, so that even if imports are going up, but your exports offset that, higher exports offset that. But your exports have to be competitive. It could be made competitive through more investment in efficiency and technology and productivity of labor, so that it could make your exports competitive. Okay. Coming to contractionary fiscal policy, and contractionary fiscal policy is just the opposite of expansionary. It is done to reduce inflation or control a growing budget deficit. Especially if the budget deficit is very high, you need to sort of control that budget deficit, and you need to come up with an austerity measure. Or maybe you have a very high national debt, so you need to reduce those debt. You need to come up with austerity programs to reduce your debt levels. And one of the ways in order to reduce your debt levels is that you come up with a contractionary fiscal policy. And that's when you reduce your spending and increase taxes. सही है. And or यहाँ contractionary fiscal policy इसलिए भी लगाई जाती है because it's done in order to reduce inflation, especially when the inflationary pressures are very very high. Your economy is overheating itself. ठीक है. मैं आपको फिर एक प्रॉब्लम जो हमें नज़र आता है जब when we are checking the exams is that बच्चे very high inflation को hyper inflation से मैच करते हैं. Hyper inflation is not very high inflation. ये गलत है. ये गलत हो जाएगा आपके एग्जाम में, आपके मार्क्स डिडक्ट हो जाएंगे, माइनस कर देंगे आप अपने मार्क्स. अगर आप हाइपर इन्फ्लेशन को वेरी हाई इन्फ्लेशन समझ रहे हैं, ये गलत बात है. हाइपर इन्फ्लेशन एक बहुत ही रेयर और एक्सट्रीम सिनेरियो है. आप ज़रा हाइपर इन्फ्लेशन की हिस्ट्री पढ़ें. वेनेजुएला में, जिम्बाब्वे में हाइपर इन्फ्लेशन कब आई है और कैसे आई है और क्यों आई है. और तो हाइपर इन्फ्लेशन और हाई इन्फ्लेशन दे आर नॉट सेम और दे आर नॉट पैरेलल, or neither they are perfect substitutes to each other. Got it? Don't make that mistake. And I said it before, I'll say it again. Hyperinflation is when your inflation rates are increasing by 50% on a monthly level. On a monthly level. हम जब कह रहे थे कि पाकिस्तान में the rate of inflation was very very high, it was more than 30% in 2023. We were talking about an annual inflation rate. Here your price level in hyperinflation is rising by 50% on a monthly level. So contractionary fiscal policy would reduce inflation by cutting government expenditures. The government cuts its spending on and government increases taxes. And the objective is that we need to target AD by reducing consumption and investment. And although yes, reducing consumption and investment is not good, but usually the government implements a contractionary fiscal policy because inflation is getting very very high. So with lower government or consumer spending, businesses would experience, a drop in, because when the consumer spending goes down and business spending goes down, when the consumer spending goes down because the government spending goes down, and government spending is a contractionary fiscal policy. So either the government reduces government spending or it increases taxes, and it increases taxes. It would increase in income taxes, it would increase sales taxes, it would increase value added taxes, it would increase business taxes. So income taxes would reduce disposable incomes, and also increasing sales taxes would reduce consumer spending as well. So consumer spending would go down, and when consumer spending goes down, businesses would also experience a drop in revenues, and they would also cut back production because economy is not witnessing a lower GDP growth and businesses are witnessing lower revenues and profits. So this would also have the impact of reducing profits and investment by the private sector firms. So the I component of AD goes down as well. And the I component of AD goes down for two reasons, because especially when contractionary fiscal measures creates a wave of consumer pessimism, and it reduces consumer spending. So businesses witness that, I mean, there's no point in investing, so I goes down. And plus, contractionary fiscal policy through implementing very high corporate profits reduces retail earnings, that reduces I as well. Now you need to understand कि ये जो investment का component है ना हमारा investment has two effects. So the first effect, or the short term or the immediate effect of investment, is that if investment goes up, your AD goes up and your LRAS goes up in the long run. So the investment immediately affects AD, but then it subsequently later on in the long run affects LRAS, right? So investment has both sides to it. And if investment is going down, your AD would go down, your economy slows down or economy contracts. But then in the long run, your LRAS, that is your productive capacity, would shift inwards as well. So do remember that investment has two sides to it. Always remember that investment would have an impact on AD, and it would in the long run have an impact on LRAS as well. Someone is saying lag ho raha hai. Are you sure lag ho raha hai? I don't think so lag ho raha hai. I mean, I don't think so. Okay, so Mustafa now says that is what I was saying before. Mustafa was saying this, an hour back, and only you were the only one who was lagging, so I don't think anyone else is lagging. So are we lagging? Lag ho raha hai? Nahi ho raha. So Mustafa was saying this 2 hours before as well. Now Mustafa is repeating. I think he's the only one who's lagging, but then he had the urge or the temperament to actually mention that he was actually saying this before as well. But okay, thank you for letting me know that I'm not lagging. बेटा कौन से नोट्स एक्सेस नहीं हो रहे? Samra says, can we say private investment are important as it stimulates economic competitiveness? Yeah, investment stimulates economic competitiveness, yes. But then how? वही वाली बात ना कि पॉइंट को एनालाइज करना है हमें स्टेट नहीं करना है. हाउ? कॉज इफेक्ट कॉन्सिक्वेंस. अब मैं आपकी सेंटेंस का कंप्लीट कर दूंगा. दैट यू से दैट private investments are important because it stimulates economic competitiveness by improving productive efficiency of the economy. And that results into either a rise in exports or balance of trade deficits goes down, or something like that. Circular flow of income के ऊपर मैं देख लूँगा. अगर past papers हम कर रहे हुए तो मैं try करूँगा. But circular flow of income के ऊपर already I have two videos on my YouTube channel. You can go and check that out. I already have covered it there. मोहम्मद खान says how to get these notes. बेटा ये notes अभी नहीं मिलेंगे आपको, अब टाइम नहीं है इन notes का. हर मटेरियल जो सामने खुला हुआ होता है ज़रूरी नहीं है कि वो मिल जाए आपको. ये वाला नहीं मिलेगा आपको मटेरियल, बिकॉज आई डोंट हैव द टाइम टू सेंड दीज. अभी मैं इसको देख लूँगा. पब्लिक उस पर लिंक पे डाल सका मैं क्लास के बाद तो मैं डाल दूँगा. बट अभी तो फ़िलहाल आई डोंट प्लान ऑन गिविंग दीज आउट at the moment, at least not right now. Class ke baad we'll see if my TAs are not if they're active, then they'll probably post it. Sir, will you talk about, sir, I mean to say private investors are more efficient than government. See now, Samra, you are saying private investors are more efficient than the government. That is what you meant to say, but you didn't say that. So no one really we're not interested in what you meant to say, because the examiner is not going to call you and ask you that what you meant to say. So the examiner is either make it right or wrong, or he'll just give you marks based on what you said. Now what you said was clearly not what you were trying to say. So what I'm going to say to you is that don't make these mistakes tomorrow in the exam. Just say exactly what you're trying to say. Sir, what is hysteresis? Why does it occurs? जी, कौन बताएगा कि hysteresis क्या होता है? जी, who will tell what is hysteresis? अच्छा जी, और कोई क्वेश्चन है? ओके so when labor Ryan says for policies some ये पाक 3+ ने सही जवाब ऑलमोस्ट दिया है. देखिए हिस्टेरिसिस का मतलब होता है कि जब आपकी स्किल्स वगैरह आउटडेट हो जाएं, ठीक है, यू आर एक्चुअली लेट्स से यू हैव सिक्लिकल अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट इन द इकोनॉमी, एडी इज फॉलिंग, सही है, तो आपकी स्किल्स वगैरह आउटडेट हो जाएं, दैट कॉजेज ultimately that unemployment which was temporary. You have to understand that cyclical unemployment is the why do we call unemployment as cyclical? The word cyclical का मतलब क्या है? What do you mean by cyclical? Cyclical in economics का मतलब ही क्या होता है? What is cyclical? Cyclical are these economic cycles, right? These are these economic cycles. So that's what cyclical unemployment is. That unemployment that goes up because of a recession, and then it goes down because the economy starts to recover. Which makes cyclical unemployment a temporary phenomena. It will recover because economy goes through periods of ups and downs, and cyclical unemployment also goes ups and downs. But when that cyclical unemployment converts into long-term unemployment because your skills would get outdated, that's when hysteresis would occur. And that would mean that once hysteresis would occur, it would become embedded in the economy. It would basically reduce your, it would shift your economy's productive capacity to the left because, your economy, but that cyclical unemployment would mean that now initially the unemployment that was cyclical would become more permanent. Basically, you समझो कि वो that unemployment, not LR potential shift होने की बात छोड़ दें उसको. अब इसको यूँ समझे कि that unemployment becomes embedded in you, where that short-term unemployment becomes a permanent sort of phenomena. ठीक है, that and उसके लिए हमें supply side policies की ज़रूरत पड़ती है, like retraining schemes and all of that, or coming up with labor market reforms and somehow trying to improve mobility and making sure that employees की skills erode now and all of that. So that's when that's what sort of cyclical unemployment, that's what hysteresis is, कि your short-term unemployment would convert or become a permanent phenomena in the economy. So ये होता है, ठीक है, got it. So hysteresis इसलिए होता है, that's when it arises. Am I clear? Is and hysteresis ka point is a very good point that you should make in actually in the exam, especially when it comes to unemployment, because hysteresis is when unemployment becomes dangerous, and hysteresis is one of the reasons why unemployment is a problem, especially जब आपके पास एग्जाम में सवाल आए ना कि is unemployment issue or not. So आप ये बताना कि unemployment always carries the risk of hysteresis, because अगर cyclical unemployment है and that causes skill erosion or it causes labor immobility, and or maybe if you're unemployed for a long period of time, you just lack the motivation to go back. So फिर वो जो cyclical unemployment होती है ना, it just becomes embedded and converts into structural unemployment. So it requires a lot of retraining, and so that's a huge problem in the economy. कोशिश करूँगा past papers discuss करने की, अगर if I have the temperament, if you guys have the temperament to discuss past papers. Anyways, moving forward, Ryan, तुम्हारा क्या question है बेटा? Can you kindly answer your sir, for policies, inflation, growth and change in exchange rate, if we use short run and long run, हाँ तो this is fine, but fixate नहीं करो अपने आप को, but yeah, short run, long run, opportunity cost, unintended consequences, दो तीन चीज़ें मैं आपको बता दूँ, हमेशा नेचर उस पर बात करना पॉलिसीज़ की कि व्हाट इज़ द साइज ऑफ द जैसे व्हाट इज़ द एक्सटेंट ऑफ द पॉलिसी, कि मे बी एक्सपेंशनरी फिस्कल पॉलिसी वुड फेल if the right level of taxation is not imposed, or the right level of government spending is, if we had to increase government spending or reduce taxation, then the right level was not done. Maybe the government lacked information, it didn't end up doing, or maybe expansionary fiscal policy was being met by contractionary monetary policy. So again, it's a government failure, a massive government failure hai aapka. So knowing or reducing the interest rates, if you're talking about a monetary policy, then reducing interest rates is important, but maybe the government, the central bank ended up reducing interest rates by an insignificant amount, or maybe it just reduced interest rates by a lot. And the objective was to stimulate the economy, although it did end up stimulating the economy, but massively reducing interest rates meant that it resulted into huge, massive demand for inflation. So that's an unintended consequence. ठीक है, कहाँ पे थे हम? वेयर वर वी एक्चुअली? कौन सा पॉइंट डिस्कस हो रहा था? हम कॉन्ट्रैक्शनरी फिस्कल पॉलिसी कर रहे थे, राइट? वी वर डिस्कसिंग कॉन्ट्रैक्शनरी फिस्कल पॉलिसी. Okay, so I was talking about how aggregate demand goes down and how firms how aggregate demand goes down and how economy would contract and how slower production would result in slower economic growth. And so contractionary fiscal policy is always running with the risk of recession, right? So businesses would sort of cut output, the economy would enter a period, the economy could enter, firstly, when businesses would cut back on output, the economy would enter into slower growth, or the economic growth would slow down, and then it would contract. And when the economic growth contracts, it means it turns negative. And if it turns negative for a continuous period of 2 months, it's when a recession strikes, right? So if the fall in AD is significant and if the fall in AD is prolonged, then it can push the economy into a recession, especially if that recession was, or if the economy was already weak, or if the economy was already recovering. And if the economy was recovering from a recession, then it ends up it ends up back into a recession. It's not a good thing. So implementing the right policy at the right time is also very important. दूसरा, आपको पता है कि कॉन्ट्रैक्शनरी फिस्कल पॉलिसी से cyclical unemployment आएगी because firms would lay off workers. But one thing is that contractionary fiscal policy is good in the sense that it could it could basically restore price stability. And price stability का मतलब है कि prices would stabilize or at least grow more slowly. Price stability means that prices would go down or at least grow more slowly. So it's restoring that price stability, and that protects the purchasing power for people, right? Especially those people who are on fixed incomes. Also, guys, do remember that when you're implementing a contractionary fiscal policy and you're implementing higher taxes and lower spending, so the government's budget balance improves, government's fiscal position improves, government की fiscal credibility in the eyes of investors improves जाती है, and that improves credit ratings of the country as well. So and it strengthens the government's fiscal position. It strengthens the government's fiscal position, giving them more room, that in the case of future emergencies, they would have those tax revenues to spend. And that narrows the budget deficit, which is a good thing, right? And that means that now they would require less borrowing, which means that, because budget deficits means more borrowing and more debt, but if the budget deficit slows down or it reduces, that means there's now it means that public debt would grow slowly or reduce, right? Because now you have fewer budget deficits, and with fewer deficits, then the national debt would grow more slowly, or may even end up, shrinking. So, which means that when your national debt is increasing because you are acquiring more debt because you had to borrow to spend, so now it means that interest obligations would go down as well, and you have now less interest obligations, which sort of frees up a lot of funds for essential spending later on, and it improves your fiscal position. It improves your investor confidence, domestic and international both, and it makes your debt sustainable, because ये fiscal austerity का measure होता है खास तौर पे जब debt की हम बात कर रहे हैं. Contractionary fiscal policy is also acts. Some contractionary fiscal policy could also act as a fiscal austerity measure as well to reduce public debt and make your debt more sustainable. Got it? So, but the fact that contractionary fiscal policy, especially if those contractionary fiscal measures are implemented very, very high, it could risk a deflation and a recession, and prices could go down massively. And although that's a good thing, but then prices falling in the context that it's becoming recessionary now, that's not a good thing. Bad deflation is a recessionary deflation is not really good. So contractionary fiscal policy, if massively implemented, could, in fact, the objective was to reduce price level but not reduce it that much, and you ended up with a complete contraction and a reduction in growth for the economy, and that's not a good thing for the economy, right? So moving forward, guys, what we what we need to do is that so it may result into a deflation, and deflation could result into deflationary spirals, right? So deflation results into a deflationary spiral. Deflation results into a deflationary spiral, and so deflations result into deflationary spirals, right? So deflations are bad because they could result into deflationary spirals. Ibrahim says, is fiscal austerity and contractionary fiscal policy the same thing? देखो same thing इस तरह से हैं that both use the same tools, but different इस तरह से हैं that, okay, so Ibrahim is asking, is fiscal austerity and contractionary fiscal policy the same thing? See, fiscal policy, contractionary fiscal policy and austerity are the same thing in the context that both use the same tools, but they're different in the context that the uses are different. While a contractionary fiscal policy is aimed at make price stability and cooling the economy down, especially during times of overheating itself, a fiscal austerity is done in order to reduce budget deficits and improve your fiscal position, fiscal stance, and for more debt sustainability and fiscal to improve your fiscal balances. Leila says, can we refer to the government being bounded by rationality? They may have good intentions but not the best means to. Very good point, excellent point, that yes, they may have the good intentions but not the best means to achieve the intended consequences. What a best way to conclude your answer. This is an excellent point that you have made. Okay, what is a deflationary spiral? I mean, it really amazes me that you have an exam tomorrow and dude, you don't know what a deflationary spiral is. That is something that really amazes me, by the way. So this is not to discourage you, but come on, guys. I mean, how can you live in a world where you just, you know, just a second. Uh, okay, so deflationary spiral. Samra is saying what a deflationary spiral is. Samra. So deflationary spiral is when the deflation just keeps on worsening itself. So just like you end up, I'll give you an example, and if you understand that, then let me know. Let's say that you end up with a bad marks in a particular subject, and when you end up with the bad marks, you lose confidence, and when you lose confidence, you think that you will not do well in the second test as well, and you think that you will not do well in the second test, and you feel that because you think that you will not do well in the second test, so you don't really study for it because you already know now in your head that you will not do well in the second test, so you don't study at all. And because you don't study, you actually end up getting the bad marks, and now you're like, whoa, look, I told myself, already told you guys I won't do well. And then you also end up, and since now you have 2 bad marks on your plate, it means that the third time you also think the same way, and then you end up, so that's a spiral of bad marks, and it is embedded in your behavior now, and that's what deflationary spiral is. And that's now coming back to whether how is this connected to a deflationary spiral is when prices start falling, consumers feel that prices would fall further, and because they feel that prices would fall further, so there's no point in buying goods right now because prices would fall later on as well. So what's the point of buying right now when we can buy cheaper goods later on? So they will delay their spending, and the delayed spending by the whole economy would mean that consumption expenditures would fall. So AD would fall further then, which will actually result into a further fall in price level. And when price level falls further, they would be like, oh, wow, look, we told you prices are supposed to fall further. Now they'll fall even further. So let's not spend any more now. So further the AD would fall because further consumption would decline. And that's, so it becomes a self-perpetuating loop where those spirals just, deflationary spirals just result into falling AD, and the recession keeps on worsening and prices keep on falling. That's what a deflationary spiral is. Got it? Are we good? So now we're done with expansionary, we're done with contractionary fiscal policy, and now we move to monetary policy. Okay. Zainab says, can we say that it improves current account since high taxes means less disposable incomes, which means ability to spend on imports decline? Now, this is theoretically correct because yes, but you have to understand that, yeah, that is correct. But you see, firstly, what will happen is that, it is correct. Technically, it is correct. What I was trying to say to you is, it will just confuse you more. So, you are correct. In theory, yes, you are correct, and this will work. This will serve as a valid point. Maria says, sir, what should a government consider, balance of trade or terms of trade? Balance of trade is a completely different thing. Terms of trade is a completely different thing. They are not the same. And an improvement in terms of trade doesn't really necessitate into an improvement in balance of trade as well. If terms of trade are improving because of inflation in the economy, and that's causing export prices to go up, so that would result into a worsening of the balance of trade. Got it? Also, by the way, policies to reduce a current account deficit, like expenditure switching and dampening policies and J curve and all of these things, This is part of A2, not AS, okay? So J curve and expenditure switching dampening policies. This is all A2 stuff. This is not AS. Marshall earner condition, J curve, expenditure switching reducing policies. This is all A2. You don't need to worry about these things. Moving forward, expansionary monetary policy. Please, in the exam tomorrow, never say that government implements a monetary policy. Government has nothing to do with the monetary policy. It is a central bank. Central bank implements the monetary policy, and we have two primary tools where we sort of reduce our, increasing money supply or, reducing interest rates. And these are the two primary tools that a central bank uses: increasing money supply and reducing interest rates. And interest rates, remember that primarily the government plays with the interest rates, and interest rates are just like the most primary tool, or the big daddy of expansionary monetary policy, where the central bank manipulates the lever of interest rates to manage inflation. So when you talk about expansionary monetary policy, and when central banks would lower its interest rates, it would mean that it would make your borrowing cheaper, and the cost of borrowing goes down. So individuals would borrow more money for spending on to borrow money for housing and luxuries and cars and furniture and educational loans. So households would borrow more money, and it would increase aggregate demand and stimulate spending. And lower interest rates means that firms would also borrow more, so business investment would rise. And investment, like I said before as well, investment has an impact on LRAS, long run aggregate supply as well. So not only investment would stimulate aggregate demand, but it would also stimulate long run aggregate supply. The businesses would also borrow money to expand their operations, and it would lead to higher investments. And see, interest rate ka dusra jo hota hai na, jo I've written over here, is the fact that you need to connect expansionary monetary policy with exchange rate. And this is actually the monetary policy transmission mechanism, and the monetary policy transmission mechanism states how monetary policy feeds through different channels in the economy before it hits aggregate demand, and how monetary policy sort of acts and how it behaves before it actually has an impact on AD, and before it actually has an impact on economic growth or inflation or something, right? So what it follows is that so you have to link it with exchange rate, because when interest rates goes down in the economy, it reduces hot money inflows, and it sort of creates more hot money outflows. So when interest rates goes down, and especially let's say that relative interest rates goes down, so your financial investors would pull back money, and they would seek better returns elsewhere, and that would increase the supply of domestic currency, resulting into a depreciation of the exchange rate. And a currency depreciation would make your exports cheaper and imports expensive, meaning that aggregate net exports will rise and aggregate demand will rise, so it will improve your trade balance. But see, our objective is not to just mention that it improves trade balance. The objective is that an expansionary monetary policy via reduction in interest rates would depreciate the exchange rate in a floating exchange rate system, and this would cause your net exports to go up. And net exports is also a component of aggregate demand, so aggregate demand goes up. So you have to understand that expansionary monetary policy is when the central bank reduces interest rates, right? And what it does is that it not only stimulates consumption spending, investment spending, but net export spending also goes up. So a lot of students don't mention the channel of exchange rate. So you have to mention this channel as well while explaining expansionary monetary policy. And we know the effects of expansionary monetary policy that would increase employment and reduce cyclical unemployment and cause more benefits. And especially you see the problem with monetary policy is that monetary policy is inflationary, especially when the economy is nearing full employment. And no one wants prices to rise. So, but again, this is the problem. We have trade-offs. Inflation, the trade-off of growth and expansion is inflation. So we need to live with it. It depends upon what problem we are trying to identify and what is the current problem that we need to solve. And that's why we always say that expansionary demand side policies should be complemented by supply side policies to make sure that inflationary pressures are, stabilized. दूसरी चीज़ ये that जब आपकी interest rates fall होते हैं, when your interest rates are falling because of expansionary monetary policy, so if you're saying that consumption is going up and investment is going up and net export is going up, and you're saying that the cost of borrowing is going down, so people borrow more. Also remember that when the interest rates are going down, the incentive to save is going down because returns on saving is going down. So people are less incentivized to save and they're incentivized to spend and borrow, right? So people are less incentivized to save, and that is why they borrow. Also remember that when people would save less, there's another point that I've mentioned in the slide as well, about the fact that I have mentioned somewhere about this, right? This point. If you look at this point, it says lower saving rate means interest on saving is falling and people save less due to lower returns. And actually what happens is that, when you're saving less, it means that the money that you save, commercial banks loan that money out to people. So if you're saving less, commercial banks have less money. So ultimately when you're saving less, what you're doing is, because you're getting lower returns, since you're getting lower returns, then you would want to preserve the value of your savings. So what you'll do is that you'll move your savings somewhere else, and probably you will seek returns elsewhere. Probably you will savers and financial investors would withdraw their money from banks and they would probably invest in property, stocks, or cryptocurrency because they need to protect the value of their savings now. And what this does is that this could lead to, it sort of leads to speculative bubbles. Speculative bubbles mean short-term asset price bubbles, where the asset prices, such as housing prices, or they just bubble out of proportion or balloon out of proportion. They start rapidly expand, not because they're actually increasing in value, but they just rapidly expand because the demand is very high than what it should be. And the asset prices, such as housing prices, they rise rapidly without the asset prices or the housing prices are rising rapidly more than what they should be. And the problem is that once these bubbles would burst, they could result into huge levels of recessions and financial instability. And that is exactly what sort of happened in the 2008 financial crisis. So if you're able to understand and comprehend this point, that's fine. But if you're not, then that's okay as well. But if you're not able to comprehend this point, because right now we don't have a lot of time to actually go through this, but I have done this in my classes. What you can say is that when people start to protect the value of their savings, they start investing in probably property or houses or other assets. It creates the asset demand goes up, and it creates speculative bubbles where it just starts the demand for those, and the asset prices start increasing massively. And if these bubbles would burst later on, it could create a massive decline in wealth, and it could create huge levels of recessions and financial instability. So that's not good. ठीक है? ये था आपका expansionary monetary policy. And contractionary monetary policy works by reducing money supply and increasing interest rates. Again, मैं आपको फिर बोल रहा हूँ कि money supply में, when you're talking about money supply, right? When you're talking about money supply, basically, money supply is the big lever of contractionary monetary policy is the big lever of contractionary monetary policy is your what is your interest rates, right? So make sure that you sort of because usually students like this, central bank would print more money. I mean, printing more money is ऐसा नहीं होता कि central bank जो है वो बस it just starts printing more money and just a cash machine is there, just starts printing more money. So the main lever that central banks would use is your interest rates. Cyclical supply side policies will not result into cyclical unemployment. Supply side policies will not result into deflationary spiral in the long run. My child, you are giving the incorrect explanation, because supply side policies se jo the deflation that happens because of supply side policies is a good deflation. That is not bad deflation. So that is a deflation that is that is welcomed. That is a deflation that we look up to, and we need that sort of deflation. So so deflation is good or bad deflation. So that is not the deflation that we really want. Okay. See, quantitative easing, again, quantitative easing, open market operations, and methods of influencing money supply. This is all A2 syllabus. This is not AS syllabus. You're not supposed to know all of this. So yeah, the only thing that you need to know as far as AS is concerned is that central banks increase money supply or reduce money supply. How they increase money supply or how they reduce money supply, you are not supposed to know. Or even the maximum that you can, the maximum that if you want to know, the maximum that you should know is that a central bank increases and reduces money supply by influencing the reserves of commercial banks, and that is all. Now, how this works, this is properly this is properly part of your A2 syllabus. So yeah, so you are not supposed to know this in AS because it is a huge, one of the most significant chapters in macroeconomics and monetary economics in A2. Got it? So the only thing that you need to know is that it increases or reduces money supply by influencing reserves of the commercial banks, and full stop. That's it. And second is your interest rates, and that is all that the central, and primarily we use is the interest rates. Okay, moving forward to contractionary monetary policy. Contractionary monetary policy. We talk about contractionary monetary policies. Again, central bank would increase interest rates or reduce money supply. And primarily the central bank works on increasing your interest rates. Primarily we work with interest rates. And contractionary monetary policy is implemented to slow down an overheating economy. Now an average student would just say that contractionary monetary policy is implemented when inflation is high. But an A-star student or a top economist would say that contractionary monetary policy is implemented to slow down overheating economies or curb inflation. That's it's all about how you write rather than what you write, because this is a theory paper, this is an essay paper, and I am saying on record that people with a very weak English language do struggle in this paper because their expression is extremely weak. So you need at least basic English expression to do well in an economics exam. You don't need fancy English, but at least you must be able to communicate what you're saying. So contractionary monetary policy kya karegi? Contractionary monetary policy will increase the cost of borrowing, it will reduce consumer spending, it will reduce investment spending, and so it would slow down economic. Yes, it would slow down. When investment spending would go down, it would slow down economic growth, and this is one of the limitations of contractionary monetary policy, and this is a trade-off that central banks would need to live with. And but then central bank needs to decide that whether inflation is very high, it should either control inflation or it should worry about slowdown of economic growth. If inflation rate is very, very high, especially for an overheating economy, then slowing down economic growth as a trade-off is something that we need to accept. Your conclusion, you can write this down. You can write this down in conclusion. So also remember that higher interest rates would result. Higher interest rates in a contractionary monetary policy would mean it would appreciate the currency because it would result into hot money inflows, as financial investors would it would result into direct deposits in your banks, because again known as hot money inflows, increasing the demand for the domestic currency, appreciating the exchange rate. And currency appreciation makes, when your currency appreciates, it becomes stronger. 1 unit of your currency can buy more units of the other currency. So it would make imports cheaper and exports expensive in the global markets, and this would just worsen your trade balance, and imports would rise and exports would fall. and as a result your net exports would go down, and net exports would go down is because AD would contract. So contractionary monetary policy would reduce in consumption spending via higher interest rates, reduce investment spending, reduce net export spending. All of this would reduce aggregate demand and reduce the price level in the economy. I would cool down the economy. The best diagram that you can make is that you could say that the economy was overheating itself and was somewhere over here, and cooling the economy would mean that we need the price level to go down. So let's say we're somewhere over here. Economy ko jo utha ke na bacche jo galti, this is something that I really don't like. I mean, don't bring the economy at this point. I mean, if you want to cool down the economy, you need to cool down inflation. You can bring the economy over here. Don't just bring the economy over here, bhai. आपको पता भी है ये point क्या है? Do you guys know what this point is? पढ़ तो रहे हैं economics, लेकिन पता है कुछ? Do you guys know what this point is? What this line is representing? This line is representing a very worse recession. So cooling down the economy doesn't mean that a central bank enacts a recession in the economy. So bring the AD down, but don't bring the AD down that you just create a huge negative output gap. Yes, one of the limitations of contractionary monetary policy is that when your net exports goes down, your trade deficit worsens. And for developing economies, a huge trade deficit is not good, because a trade deficit arising from a current account deficit would then need to be financed by external borrowing. And external borrowing could mean rising national debt, which is again not good for various reasons, multiple reasons, and I think made a YouTube video on it. It's on my Instagram as well. Why is rising, or I think it's on my YouTube. You can check that out. Also, investments will fall only, so AD will fall, but this would have a negative long-term impact, especially LRAS would fall. So we need to look at to what extent is investment falling. And even if, let's say, the AD is going down and the central bank is worried about the fact that, okay, fine, inflation would go down, but we would end up with economic contraction. यही तो words, use these words ना in the exam. ये words आप use करें exam में. Economic contraction, economic stagnation, economic slowdown. If the central bank is worried for all these things, and the fact that central bank is worried that recession might strike, then ठीक है, you implement you complementary supply side policy implement करें आप, so that the result, this fall in GDP, the fall in GDP is basically the fall in GDP is basically offset or recovered through supply side measures. But if the economy is import dependent for raw material, won't it be beneficial? Zainab says if the economy is dependent for, yes, it would be beneficial, but it will only be beneficial to the extent that it would reduce cost push inflationary pressures. If the economy is import dependent, and yes, in that context it would. So, but that's just, again, you have to understand that when you're saying that it would be beneficial, so just because it is beneficial doesn't mean that we overcome or just turn a blind eye to all the other limitations. So this is what you need to learn. You guys need to understand that when you are talking about something, then you need to speak with precision that what exactly are you saying. Okay, you know what? Okay, fine. I mean, your point is 100% valid. That if the economy is import dependent, it will, cause a problem. It will be recession. I mean, it will. So a student says, does circular flow comes as an 8 marker or 12? It could come as an 8 marker as well. You guys ask the most stupidest questions of all times, like the record breaking stupid questions. And a day before the exam, I don't know, something happens to the kids. They asking the weirdest questions. Does circular flow of income comes as an 8 marker or 12 marker? But it could come as an 8 marker. It could either come as a 12 marker. Syllabus में तो नहीं लिखा हुआ ना कि हम 8 देंगे 12 देंगे. So it could come as any marker. Instead of worrying whether it will come as an 8 marker or 12 marker, you should be worried about understanding and knowing the circular flow of income. And you have 2 videos. I have 2 videos over there on my YouTube channel. Go and search those and go through those. Anyways, okay. So appreciate ये बात. So again, also, by the way, जो ज़ैनब ने एक बात कही थी, मैं उसी बात को यहाँ कंटिन्यू करूँगा. Zainab Sayed ने एक बात कही थी. So if you look at this, so when your net exports are falling, your AD is falling. So and in case studies, they usually give this impact. In a case study question, they would say that this currency is appreciating, and they would talk about what will be the impact on inflation. So usually the students would talk about demand for inflation. Always think about both inflation. So if I continue with Zainab's point, then the fact that appreciation is causing if the currency is appreciating, your net exports are going down, so demand pull inflation would go down, but then cost push inflation would go down as well, especially when the import cost, because the import cost of key raw materials will go down, and that would mean the cost of production goes down, so SRAS will increase, and that would feed through lower cost push inflation in the economy. So cost push inflationary pressures would go down as well. So an appreciation would not only reduce demand for inflationary pressures, it would also reduce your cost push inflationary pressures as well. Are we good? Got it? So moving forward, guys, since we are done with I think we are done with contractionary monetary policy as well. हम आ जाते हैं terms of trade के ऊपर. Terms of trade is again a problematic thing for you guys. Terms of trade, you guys know what terms of trade is. Simply the it's basically your the formula is average price of exports over the average price of imports, and terms of trade would improve when मैंने terms of trade पे मेरे 3 घंटे के lectures है terms of trade पे, so I have 3 hours of lectures. You guys can watch that. Terms of trade would improve when export prices would rise and the import prices would fall. That's when the terms of trade improves, right? And so now the point when you're saying that an improvement in the terms of trade means that the same basket of exports could now buy more imports. That's what an improvement in terms of trade means. So and so the thing is that if the terms of trade is improving, and let's say that terms of trade is improving because the demand for exports is going up, and the demand for exports is going up, so export revenues, the export prices are rising. Terms of trade is improving, export prices are rising because the demand for exports is going up. That's causing the export prices to rise, and that's causing terms of trade to improve. And now that would translate into an improvement in your balance of trade as well. So the current account deficits would go down, and there would be more foreign exchange coming into the current in your country. So current account deficits would reduce, or balance of trade would improve. So if the demand for your export goes up, that causes the price of exports to goes up. That causes your terms of trade to improve, and that would also result into an improvement in balance of trade of the economy as well. So that's the chain that I've created here. Also remember that when more higher export revenues would then uska phir effect ye hoga if the terms of trade are improving because of this. If the terms of trade are improving because of the rise in demand for goods, right? So it would cause an appreciation in the currency because your currency would appreciate, and a currency appreciation would make your imports cheaper, and it could reduce cost push inflation, especially for consumers, and firms would benefit because they would now be able to import. Consumers would be able to import, let's say, cheaper medicines, and so consumer welfare would go up, especially if you're importing medicines. So that's something good for consumers, and firms would benefit by more profits because obviously they could import oil and other key commodities such as copper, aluminium, iron at a lower cost. So again उसका भी फ़ायदा हमें हो रहा है. So हमें improvement in terms of trade के reasons देखने. अगर improvement in terms of trade इसलिए आ रहा है because export prices are going up, because if the export prices are going up because of a rise in demand for exports, So that would definitely translate into an improvement in balance of trade. That would also mean that your currency would appreciate, and appreciating currency would mean that lower cost plus inflation, and appreciating currency means that consumers would benefit in terms of cheaper medicines and all of that. So cheaper imports means fall in imported inflation as cost of living would improve, and you will end up importing lower import cost in terms of oil would go down. So that is something beneficial, especially for an economy that is highly dependent on import of oil, and जिसका import bill majorly key commodities. Pakistan का major import bill ही आपकी key import oil contributes major to oil imports. Also, terms of trade improve हो रहे हैं, and there's more export revenues because of higher demand for export, means that your export industries will expand. It will lead to potentially higher wages in the export sector, higher employment in the export sector. Also, remember that cheaper import of electronics or cheaper import of medicines would improve material standard of living for people. Household will enjoy higher living standards. Cheaper imports means more imports of consumer choice बढ़ जाती है, that would result into improving living standards. So that's an advantage जो हम बात कर सकते हैं. But again, ये advantage depend करता है कि terms of trade के improvement के reasons क्या हैं. So ये सारे आपके terms of trade के improvement के. Also अगर terms of trade में gains हो रहे हैं, and also जब आपका export sector improve होगा, you're saying your cost push inflation will go down, your exports would improve. That would mean that export sector would expand. The government would also benefit. Government would benefit with more tax revenues. So government would experience a better financial health. So government could use those funds and tax revenues to spend on public investment in healthcare, education, infrastructure, and business. And so again, rising exports, if net exports are going up, rising net exports is a sign of economic growth. It would result into demand-led growth. And rising growth would mean an economy's business confidence would go up, and rising business confidence could translate into higher investment. So the I component will go up. So business could invest in R&D, innovation, expansion, and that would boost long-term growth in the economy. ये सब advantages हैं in terms of trade की improvement. सही है. सो एक्सपोर्ट सेक्टर बढ़ेगा तो मोर एम्प्लॉयमेंट इन दी एक्सपोर्ट सेक्टर भी होगी. गॉट इट. बट बात वही है कि टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड की इम्प्रूवमेंट, इफ इट इज़ कमिंग फ्रॉम and that could also result into an imbalance, because it could create a sectoral imbalance, because actually what's happening is that only your exports, because if the terms of trade gains are coming from a very few key sectors, like terms of trade के में improvement जो आ रही है is coming from a higher export demand in, let's suppose you're importing more oil or more gas or copper to other countries, and that's increasing the demand for exports, and that's also causing a rise in the export prices, also causing an improvement in terms of trade. So these sectors will boom in the economy, which will, yes, it will translate into a balance of payment, benefits, and balance of trade will improve, current account deficits will reduce, probably turn into a surplus as well. So all good things will happen in the economy, but then at the same time, there's a sectoral imbalance. It will create that growth is not inclusive. It's not inclusive growth. It's not balanced growth. It's not balanced growth. So there's इसको कहते हैं sectoral imbalance, and the growth is not inclusive and it's neither balanced. So it could make your other sectors, so some sectors are booming while others are stagnating. So it could just make other sectors more vulnerable, right? Also remember कि अगर आपकी currency appreciate हो रही है because of higher demand for currency, higher demand for currency is artificially reducing your export. So that's not good. So if you're saying that your terms of trade is improving, because of higher export demand, then and that's causing the balance of trade to improve as well, because people are importing more from you, so your exports are growing. But then that could cause a currency appreciation, and a currency appreciation could artificially make exports uncompetitive, and it could mean that if the demand for exports is price elastic, that's not good, which means that your price sensitive export industries over time would witness a decline in export. So the point is that, the initial increase in export revenues would be later on offset by a fall in export revenue. So although your current account deficits would go down and your balance of trade position will improve, but then it could go down as well, especially for those exporting sectors where the demand for exports is elastic. Okay? And the other export sectors would they would be at a loss because their exports are elastic, and not all exports are elastic in an economy, but then those which are, and probably they are vulnerable sectors, so they'll have to bear that burden. So export revenues will decline because of a currency appreciation, which will potentially reverse. It will sort of reverse the earlier gains that were made because of improvement in terms of trade. So improvement in terms of trade could translate into improvement in balance of trade, but then a currency appreciation could reverse all of that. So floating exchange rate system could, right? See, in your exam, just write about monetary policy में central banks increase or reduce money supply or interest rates. Exchange rate manipulation is not, you don't manipulate the exchange rate like that. सही है. Although some economists treat exchange rate manipulation under monetary policy, but exchange rate आप इस तरह बैठे बैठे मैनिपुलेट नहीं कर देते कि एक्सचेंज रेट आपने करेंसी को डीवैल्यू कर दिया, रीवैल्यू कर दिया. इस तरह होता नहीं है. प्रैक्टिकली आपका जो मेन लीवर है फॉर मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी, दैट इज़ योर इंटरेस्ट रेट्स. So it would be safe to just mention and stick on the fact that monetary policy involves changes in money supply and interest rates. Although for MCQs, and for case studies as well, at least you should know that exchange rate manipulation could be involved as changes to monetary policy. But then the point is that exchange rate में आप change किस तरह करोगे? How will you change an exchange rate? You will either devalue your currency or revalue, which is not part of your AS syllabus, so you don't need to worry. Sir, the theories and wording you use are difficult to adjust. Again, the wording and the theories I'm saying are not difficult. They are those that are used by common day economists. Now, the fact that you are not really equipped and you don't know about them is something that has to do with your economic vocabulary. Now, this is the problem that you need to understand. Now, this is the problem that the fact that the theories that you are using are difficult to adjust. No, it's not difficult. ये सब किताबों में लिखी हैं ये सारी वर्डिंग्स. अब आपको आदत है इतना बेसिक पढ़ने की, तो इससे थोड़ी ग्रेड आता है. कोई ओ लेवल इकोनॉमिक्स का पेपर थोड़ी है ये कि इजी वर्डिंग्स लिख कर आ जाएं बच्चों वाली. एंड मुस्तफ़ा, आपने जितनी भी बातें अब तक की हैं ना, उसमें से मेजॉरिटी बातें आपकी वो हैं जो कोई सेंस नहीं बना रही. तो थोड़ा अपनी लेवल, इकोनॉमिक्स की लेवल को इम्प्रूव करें. ये बहुत बेसिक बातें हैं जो हम कर रहे हैं, ये लिटरली बेसिक हैं. अभी तो मैंने मुश्किल वर्ड्स यूज़ ही नहीं किए हैं आपके सामने. मैं तो बहुत अपने आप को रिस्ट्रिक्ट कर रहा हूँ कि मैं जो लाइव स्ट्रीम में कर रहे हैं वो बहुत रिस्ट्रिक्टेड लेके चल रहा हूँ मैं. वरना अभी तो मैंने इकोनॉमिक्स अपनी जो वर्ड्स हैं, एक्चुअल जो वर्ड्स हैं, वो अभी मैंने बताने शुरू नहीं किए हैं अभी. सर, इन मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी सेंट्रल बैंक्स, ये तो हो गया ना. डज राइटिंग स्किल मैटर्स? एनुल हुसैन सेज राइटिंग स्किल्स मैटर इन दिस पेपर. राइटिंग स्किल्स बहुत मैटर करती हैं आपकी, बहुत ज़्यादा मैटर करती हैं. राइटिंग स्किल्स बहुत मैटर करती हैं. दे आर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. राइटिंग स्किल्स आर वेरी 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 इंपॉर्टेंट इन दिस पेपर. Now, when I say writing skills, it means that the way you are writing and the way you are saying things. So, okay. And all those students who haven't really gone through the final framework video, I would suggest you to go through the final framework video. It is a very, very important video. It's a must-watch video for tomorrow's exam. देखें, अगर आपके पास पॉलिसी कंपैरिजन का सवाल आया तो वो पॉलिसी पे डिपेंड करता है कि, लेकिन हमेशा यू ऑलवेज आर सपोज टू सजेस्ट ऑल्टरनेटिव पॉलिसीज़ दैट that could complement and reduce the unintended consequences. Okay, so improvement तो almost हमारी हो गई ना. Got it? Improvement हो गई. Now worsening of terms of trade. Terms of trade could worsen because of your export prices going down or import prices going up, and that's when terms of trade could worsen. And if the terms of trade worsens, basically, if your terms of trade worsens, it means that the country, if the terms of trade are worsening because of lower export demand, that's not a good thing. Export demand, okay. But you see, the problem is that if export demand is worsening due to a global recession, so let's say that your major trading partners are going through a recession, now that's not your problem to deal with. So it's not underlying a structural weakness. So although worsening of the terms of trade could, or deterioration of the terms of trade could translate into lower export earnings, and it could worsen a current account deficit, especially when the demand for your exports is going down, because the demand for exports is going down because why? Because of a global recession, or there's a recession in the major trading partners. Now that's not your problem to deal with, it's their problem. But then that has an impact on you. But this is not a but then this is very cyclical in nature. It will automatically stabilize on its own later on. If once their recession improves, when their central bank intervenes, when their governments do something about their recession, so your exports would then stabilize and current account position will improve on its own. So it's not indicating a structural weakness. So it's not much of a problem to deal with, or not much of a problem to be concerned about. So ठीक है. So ठीक है, lower export earnings होंगी, current account deficit में जा सकता है आपका, because also do remember that, so if the terms of trade is worsening because of a lower export demand, which is causing a fall in price of exports, also remember that this would mean a currency depreciation, because when export demand goes down, the demand for currency goes down, and that causes a currency depreciation. And the currency depreciation means that exports will become more expensive. A currency depreciation would mean that imports would become more expensive. And expensive imports, especially when the imports are inelastic, when the PD for imports is inelastic, it could mean higher cost push inflation. So, because when the currency weakens, it takes more of the local currency to buy the same amount of foreign currency, to buy the same amount of imports. And this could impact essential goods, because especially if you're importing medicines or machinery or something, or capital goods, it could have an impact on economic growth and consumer welfare. So consumers and producers both would face higher cost, which would erode real incomes and living standards. And for businesses, it would mean lower profits. And plus, for inflation, it could mean cost push inflation. So higher import prices would result in cost push inflation, right? So ये बात हो गई. Plus, मैंने आपको बताया कि this could worsen the trade deficit when export demand is going down, right? And okay. Now I would ठीक है. So let's now move on to the next slide. I think I don't want to spend a lot of time on terms of trade because इसकी already videos हैं, and let's sort of move on. I want to now move on to exchange rate. Exchange rate में if you watch those 3 videos on terms of trade, आपका पूरा cover हो जाएगा. So let's move on to exchange rate. Exchange rate appreciate क्यों होता है? Exchange rate appreciation means your currency demand is going up. That could cause a exchange rate appreciation, or the currency supply going down. That would cause an exchange rate appreciation. So if the exchange rate appreciates, it makes your imports cheaper. It results in a fall in cost push inflation because your imports are cheaper, and it could mean that imported goods and raw materials are now cheaper. So you would benefit from lower oil import, lower electronics, and lower machinery import, which would reduce cost push inflation and help in stabilizing prices. And consumers also remember that domestic consumers, because of a currency appreciation, domestic consumers would switch to cheaper imports, because now consumers would want, and so if consumers would switch to cheaper imports, then that would build pressure on domestic firms and domestic industries to compete, and this could be beneficial for them to an extent, but then this could also result into job losses in domestic firms. Also, appreciation makes your exports more expensive for foreign buyers, so it lowers export demand. Lowering export demand could mean that, especially if the markets are price elastic, then it could result in a fall in export volumes, which would result in a fall in export revenues, and exporters would end up losing their contracts, and export revenues would fall. And so it could also it could cause unemployment in the export industries. So the trade surplus will shrink or trade deficit will widen. So currency appreciation will result into a shrinking of the trade deficit. Currency appreciation would reduce the trade surplus or widen the trade deficit. Okay? And cause unemployment in the export sector. Also remember that appreciation से क्या होता है कि appreciation से cheaper imports हो रही हैं. तो अगर imports cheaper हो रही हैं, so if you're importing cheaper raw material and stuff like that, so it would reduce inflation, especially cost push inflation, and that would increase the real incomes. Also ये बात आप याद रखिएगा that when currency appreciates, ठीक है, when your currency appreciates, so an appreciation in the currency reduces the debt servicing burden. ठीक है, ये जो debt servicing burden मैंने लिखा हुआ है, because when currency appreciate, what happens is that 1 unit of rupee can buy more dollars now. So if I am supposed to pay back my debt in dollars, I need to pay less rupees now. So it reduces the debt servicing burden, especially for governments and for those governments and states that have a lot of debt. So for people like us, appreciation of the rupee would benefit us, especially in terms of debt servicing, right? So हमारी तो external liabilities बहुत हैं, right? So debts, so उस context में it reduces the debt servicing burden, because now it takes fewer of the local currency, such as rupees and Pakistani rupees, to repay foreign loans and dollars, right? This is a very good benefit that you could write. ये लिखा हुआ भी है इधर. Got it? Also remember that when your currency appreciates, it becomes expensive for foreign tourists and all to spend in the country, and this sort of makes tourism price unattractive, and it hurts tourism sector, especially if the economy is a tourism economy, so it could affect that. It could hurt sector. And tourism में बहुत चीज़ है. I mean, tourism में hotels, airlines, restaurants, local markets, सब all come in tourism. So that is something that you could write. Also remember that, you know, when your currency appreciates, when you have a strong currency, it's indicating a strong currency that would reduce your foreign direct investment, because, you know, what that does is that appreciation would mean that, you know, foreign investors now need to bring in a lot of dollars to buy the same assets in the domestic economy. So that would increase the cost of acquiring local assets for foreign investors, because let's say FDI क्या होती है? FDI is either you start operations in the domestic economy or you end up buying equity in a domestic firm. Foreign investors buy equity in a domestic firm. That is also FDI. So point remains that appreciation of the currency would raise the cost of acquiring local assets for foreign investors in the domestic markets, which makes FDI less attractive, right? So a slowdown in FDI inflows would not be good for the economies, for the fact that it would, because FDI is very important for long-term growth in the economy. Plus FDI say, you know, it results into a rise in foreign currency reserves. So that's not good, right? ये हो गया. Then हमारे पास है exchange rate depreciation. ठीक है? Exchange rate depreciation की बात करते हैं. Exchange rate depreciation would mean exchange rate depreciation is when the currency depreciates because either the demand for the currency goes down or the supply of the currency goes up. And if the demand for the currency goes down or the supply of the currency goes up, you know, just a second. If the demand for the currency goes down or the supply of the currency goes up, what would happen is that a depreciation would make your imports more expensive, and especially it would result into cost push inflation. because a depreciation would make your imported goods very expensive, and right, and if you're an import dependent nation, it's not good for you. Also, depreciation would make your exports cheaper. So it would increase export competitiveness, and if the demand for exports is price elastic, it could improve a current account deficit, reduce a current account deficit, improve the balance of trade position. So ये बात आप लिख सकते हैं. And improved trade balance means that if your exports are rising, it would. And also remember that, you see, okay, fine, we agree that exchange rate depreciation means that the demand for, some imports are inelastic, like oil and all of that, but not all imports are inelastic. Import for luxury goods and consumer electronics, that's not inelastic. So what will happen is that currency depreciation would make all these imports expensive, which would reduce these imports and improve the trade balance. So your exports are going up and your imports are going down, so your balance of trade position is improving. So again, a currency depreciation would improve the balance of trade, it would increase national income, it would result in more economic growth, and it would increase aggregate demand in the economy. So again, net exports will rise, and it will result in, which is a very, by the way, rising net exports for a lot of economies is a very strong contributor to rising GDP. So economic growth आएगी उससे, ठीक है. More economic growth means more employment, higher incomes, higher living standards. So it's a economic stimulus to the economy, right? So currency depreciation could inject an immediate stimulus to the economy suddenly. And currency depreciation is a good thing, especially when your economy is going through a recession. So it would basically improve improve your economy's recession. The fact that there's a recession in the economy could reduce those recessions, ठीक है. Also, जब आपकी करेंसी also ज़रूरी नहीं है कि इन्फ्लेशन हमेशा आए, कॉस्ट प्लस इन्फ्लेशन आए. It could also be that depreciation could mean that since import prices are rising, so imported inflation could fall as well. You have to understand that not all, if you have an alternative where you could probably end up importing cheaper imports from elsewhere, so some cost push inflation will go down, right? It's not that all imported inflation. So, ठीक है, raw materials, oil, copper की तो चलो import demand inelastic होती है, but then some cost push inflation could go down, so it could lead to falling imported inflation. So the fact that, right, so some inflation will go down because especially imported inflation will go down when your currency depreciates. Also, weaker currency means higher foreign debt repayment burden. आपका debt repayment burden जो है वो बढ़ जाता है. मैंने यहाँ कहीं लिखा हुआ है, guess. Foreign debt repayment burden आपको, foreign debt repayment burden goes up, so the debt servicing cost goes up. Okay, tourism would be impacted because again, like I said, a weaker currency would make your domestic goods and services cheaper for foreign investors, which will attract tourism. More visitors might come into your country, boosting hospitality, boosting transport and retail sectors. And for a lot of countries, tourism is a very valuable source of foreign currency reserves and foreign currency exchange, right? Again, foreign investors, because the opposite point है that foreign investors can buy more local assets, like foreign investors can purchase more of domestic firms at a very cheaper rate because of currency depreciation with the same amount of foreign currency. So they need less dollars to buy our firms now, which will reduce the foreign direct investment cost. That would result in more foreign direct investment inflows. FDI would go up. And we know what FDI does to the economy. FDI brings in capital, technology, job creation hoti hai usse, which is good for long-term economic growth and all of that. सही है. And like I said, the currency depreciation results into imported goods being expensive, which reduces the consumption of foreign products, and consumers switch from imported goods to domestic alternatives, which helps domestic industry, which is good. But then the fact that for this point to be shown as a benefit, we should have domestic goods available for us to satisfy our consumers, right? Moving forward, guys, basically our live session is gonna end probably in a few minutes. Not in a few minutes, but in less time. because now I'm going to be ending the, almost we're done with the whole of macro. बाकी budget surplus और budget deficit की बाकी हैं दो slides, but I think ये more or less आप मेरी videos से, you can just check out my videos on budget deficit and budget surplus. That should be enough. And now I am going to be taking a 5-minute break, and what I would want and what I would request you to do is that all those students who haven't been attending this session right now, I want you guys to call them back, because whatever I'm going to be explaining right now is very, very important for tomorrow's paper. Very, very important for tomorrow's paper, because now I'm going to be explaining the key things. So we are taking a 5-minute break. We're coming back after 5 minutes. You call all your friends back on the stream, because now is going to be the most important things being said. I will be talking about the evaluation that you are supposed to write and how you can start an evaluation, all of that. So everything now would be, the next half an hour would be very crucial. So I'm probably going to be ending by 11:15, 11:20ish. So yeah, after 5 minutes we're meeting again. Okay. Okay, so we are back. There's a question: if the currency is appreciating, economy imports its raw material less prices, reducing cover production, gives signals to producers to increase the production. That will increase AS. So in this case, it benefits the economy, not only right. This is beneficial, right? Because it will increase short on aggregate supply, because if the currency is appreciated and the economy is importing cheaper raw materials, so that's a benefit, because your short on aggregate supply would increase, and it would reduce imported inflation, so it's a benefit. It's a benefit in terms of reducing cost push inflation, but it's a negative consequence in terms of that could lead to a current account deficit as well. So these are two different things. One is a limitation while the other is a gain. Okay, so let's now discuss something. Okay, guys, so let's now discuss some important things. I hope you can hear me, and are you all with me? So so in this case, what we will write that will lead to current account. See, in what case you're saying, if the currency is appreciating, so imports are getting cheaper, and if the demand for imports is price elastic, then it would lead to higher import expenditures, and that would mean that it will result into a current account deficit. But for certain imports, such as the import of oil, which is import price inelastic, it will not increase import expenditures in that context, for because you're still going to import the same quantity of oil or almost the same, so your import bills would go down in that context. So the fact that a currency appreciation will result into a current account deficit is not primarily linked, or not because of import of oil or cheaper raw materials or cheaper commodity imports, but because it would just result into more imports being sucked in the economy, because imports would just get cheaper. So it primarily depends on your import elasticity, and the fact that imports are elastic, it would result in more imports being sucked in the economy, just like a vacuum, because people would go mad because imports would get cheaper, right? That's the reason why the current account deficit would occur, and the reason why lower inflation occurs, that I already told you. Okay. Lorentz curve and Marshall is not part of the ES syllabus, it's part of A2. Okay guys, now before I move on, मैं कुछ evaluation की important चीज़ें थी मुझे आपसे, I had to discuss with you guys, and if you guys allow me, I hope you guys are doing well. Are you guys nervous? Is there anything that you want to discuss? There's a lot. I mean, a lot of you. I mean, almost. Are you guys nervous for tomorrow? Are you guys tensed? Okay, you're nervous. Okay, so अब ज़्यादा लंबा आप लोग don't overdo, in the sense that रात भर don't pull all nighters, because don't pull all nighters, because you need a lot of energy for tomorrow's exam, and I'm sure that a lot of you people also have S1 tomorrow as well. So don't pull all nighters. I'm literally saying don't pull all nighters, okay? And because you have an exam in the morning, AM paper, and you need to save energy and you need to write. Now, now guys, an important thing that I would be discussing is, just a second, I would... So I just wanted. Okay, so in the end, basically, we are almost about to wrap up our session, and this is very important. And actually, this is very very important that I'm going to be discussing today. वैसे technically हमने अपना पूरा macroeconomics revise कर लिया. In I think 2.5 hours we almost done, like पूरा ही हो गया macroeconomics revise, सारे main chapters हो गए. Budget deficit surplus रह गया, but I thought that I think you guys are also tired as well, and you guys want some more tips and tricks वाला part rather than the course thing. So वो you can. प्रशांत मैं assess whether supply side policy is the most effective way to achieve long run growth. In the MS says long run economic growth is likely to need both growth of AD and AS. Yeah, it's correct because I mean, you have to understand that what the MS primarily means is that if aggregate supply goes up and your potential goes up. Okay, so let me explain it this way. If you have to understand that, let's say that your economy, that you're right now on your PPC, and this is your potential, because PPC represents your potential, right? So if long run economic growth would result into an outward shift in PPC, and so your PPC goes outward and there's an outward shift in PPC, but you're still here, right? You're still here. You're still on this point. So in order to be on this point, I mean, your aggregate demand needs to go up, right? Otherwise, you won't really be on this point. So that, I mean, what they're trying to say to you is, or let's say that another way to sort of explain what the marking scheme is trying to say to you is let's say that this is your aggregate demand in the economy, and although there's long run economic growth, your LRAS is shifted outwards. But you need to understand that your potential has gone up, but there's no actual growth in the economy because your potential is going up, but you won't really be able to materialize that because you don't really have a demand right now. So it must also intersect a demand curve, and the fact that it's intersecting a demand curve simply means that it's intersecting a demand curve simply means that you also have demand. So there's more actual growth in the economy as well. So there's more demand in the economy as well. So for the aggregate supply, aggregate supply simply means the fact that your LRAS shifts outwards means that the potential goes up, and the fact that I have a lot of potential doesn't really has to do with anything. It won't lead me anywhere or nowhere if I'm not able to utilize that potential. And for potential to go up, I need to also, I also need to have demand basically. And that is why it's sort of trying to say that, okay. Yeah. हाँ, मतलब इस तरह के क्वेश्चंस के लिए आप एक्चुअल ग्रोथ और LRAS दोनों बताएं, मतलब डिमांड, एक्चुअल ग्रोथ और LRAS दोनों के ऊपर बात करें. Okay guys, now moving forward, I would I would not take a lot of your time, because what's the actual difference between short run and long run? Short run growth is simply demand led growth that occurs due to a rise in AD, and we're calling it short run because the moment your economy goes to a recession, so you're going in a cyclical है ना यार, cyclical है, इसलिए तो short term बोल रहे हैं. I mean ठीक है, expansionary fiscal policy लगा दिया आपने, you're very good and you're flexing the fact, Prime Minister, your head of state comes in, it does a press conference that, we're expecting a growth now. Probably you will, but then, there's a war going on, or there's a recession in the globe, in your other countries there's a recession, and that causes AD to fall. So growth level goes back down. So it's a short-term growth because it's growth that is caused due to cyclical factors. But then there's another type of growth that is more sustainable in long run because it enhances your potential. So that is potential growth, and that happens due to supply side policies. I hope you understand what short run and long run growth is. So growth that happens because of a rise in aggregate demand, or growth that happens because of a rise in short run aggregate supplies. Both short run growth and long run growth is the rise in LRAS. देखिए floating exchange rate पे they could primarily ask you about the appreciation and depreciation के causes and its impacts. Okay. or they could say simply say assumption means that you question its reality. For instance, you say, and this is very useful for questions where they talk about how successful elasticities are. How successful elasticities are. How successful elasticities are in how successful PD is, or whether PD is good, or whether PD is PS, how useful it is, how useful XCD is. So you challenge the assumptions that, elasticities have their own limitations, because the data that we use in elasticities, that data could be outdated, right? So you challenge its assumptions. You challenge the assumption of the price. You challenge the assumption. You challenge the reality. You challenge the relevance, and you challenge the universality of the key assumptions that you're making, right? Also, for instance, if you're talking about policies, you're talking about supplies, you're talking about subsidies improving the consumption of merit goods, or indirect taxes reducing the consumption of merit goods. You challenge the assumption that maybe government lacks perfect information regarding how much taxes to be imposed, or how much subsidies to be imposed, and that could result into the fact that if too much subsidies are imposed, then that could result into overconsumption or underconsumption, problem being worsened rather than solved, right? You consider multiple perspectives. Multiple perspectives means that you evaluate from the perspective of different stakeholders. For example, if the question comes, discuss whether maximum prices should be imposed on, discuss whether maximum prices are always beneficial for consumers. Now, while they are beneficial for consumers, but there are there are various other different stakeholders that we need to consider from, right? So evaluating from the point of view of different stakeholders is very, very important, because we need to also look at the fact that consumers, producers, workers, government, future generations, what are the impact on them? So okay, fine, subsidies could be used to increase the consumption of merit goods, but what would the impact be on other sectors? What would be the impact on consumers? What would be the impact on the government? We know that subsidies result in deadweight loss. We also know that indirect taxes result in deadweight loss. By the way, the deadweight loss argument doesn't hold true when we are talking about subsidies in the case of merit goods, or indirect taxes in the case of demerit goods. So that's the deadweight loss argument doesn't hold true over there. Okay. So I don't think so. My voice is lagging. I don't think so. Honestly. I think there's something, the internet problem is on your side. So again, consider multiple perspective means what are the consequences of inequality. So let's say if you're imposing taxes, then taxes could result into inequality of income. We know that taxes are regressive in nature. So we know that policies or government intervention can create unintended consequences, which can be used as a point to sort of question the effectiveness of the policy itself, right? So you need to consider multiple perspectives. So all of these points are very, very useful for evaluation. Number one, challenging the assumptions. Number two, consider. Now, obviously, for every question, different perspective. Now, I have given like 8 to 9 different evaluation skills. Now, not all evaluation skills you will be using from here. Depends upon the question, right? Also, elasticity is something that is my voice lagging? Okay. Let me be very clear. Guys, you need to understand that your paper is in like less than 12 hours. Now, there's no point in me sharing all these PDFs right now. You don't have the time to go through all these PDFs again, right? Now, I'm going to be sharing these PDFs with my registered students, but it's very difficult for me to publicly email you guys these PDFs, because right now it's practically impossible. The moment my live stream ends, I will be I will be probably connecting with my own. I have a lot of answers to check. There's a lot that needs to be done right now. My team, I need to connect with my team as well, because they are also busy checking the answers for students. So that's a bit difficult for me. I don't think so. There's my voice is lagging. Neither my video is lagging. If it's lagging, please let me know, because I don't think it is. So now Prashant has mentioned a very important point. If my evaluation point is not in the MS, will I still be marked? Yes, because your 12 markers are your level-based marking. Level-based marking doesn't really follows word by word your level-based marking doesn't really follows your points, step-by-step points from the marking scheme. Your point-based marking does. Say your case studies are point-based marking. 8 markers are point-based marking. Your level-based marking will not follow your step-by-step marking. Got it? It will not follow the step-by-step marking. So your points can differ, and your level-based marking, which is your 12 marker, you could differ from the marking scheme, but you shouldn't be differing from the marking scheme, especially when you're concerned with point-based marking. Okay. Policy combinations. Uske baad, another thing, elasticity matters. Elasticity definitely matters. When you're talking about government intervention, especially the importance of PD and PES, how responsiveness of consumers and producers, how can it affect the likely outcome of the policy, and the likely outcome of the policy depends upon the elasticity of demand and supply. You must mention this as well. Time frame is again very important. Jab bhi aap what is the time frame, as in the short run versus the long term effect? Does the policy have a different? It might have a different outcome in the short term versus the long run, right? Are long term consequences more significant? Let's say, for instance, if you're imposing a maximum price on wheat, right? So maybe in the short term it could work, but it won't work in the long term, right? So it's a good point that you can make to finish off an essay. So remember, also policy combinations. So policy combinations ki bahut important baat isliye because sometimes one policy alone doesn't really work. So a mix of policy. Let's say if you're talking about subsidies, so subsidies could be complemented by information provision or advertising, while indirect taxes could be sort of indirect taxes could also be complemented by information provision. And this actually happens for both micro and macro policies. Again, the risk of government failure is something that is very, very important. That maybe the government intervention could make things worse, especially when you're talking about unintended consequences, information gaps, administrative cost, all of that. This could deepen an existing market failure, because if the risk of government intervention is very, very high, the risk of government intervention could actually make the consequences worse, especially when you have. Just a second, guys, let me answer this. The risk of government intervention, government failure, let's say, maybe there are a lot of information gaps. Maybe the government didn't really know how much taxes or subsidies to implement, what were the administrative costs. So it could be a lot of unintended consequences. And I remember, मैंने जो आप लोगों को लाइव सेशंस में इतनी केस स्टडीज़ और बहुत सारे P2s करवाए थे, उसमें हमने ये बहुत जिक्र किया है इसका. What is the risk of non-government intervention, right? What is the risk that if the government does nothing, could the market failure worsen? Could the externalities worsen? Could the demerit goods problem worsen? Right? So the economic and social cost of inaction is also very important. And, maybe if the market failure right now, saying that indirect taxes are bad, or also needs to be considered from the fact that, okay, fine, indirect taxes might appear bad, but the fact that the market failure could have worsened, or the demerit goods problem would have worsened if there would have been no government intervention, and the economic and social cost of inaction are also great, and it could result into a long-term negative consequences because demerit goods create and impose a social cost on society, right? It creates welfare losses for society. So prioritization and trade-off is again another thing that we could talk about. Which policies are most cost effective, whether subsidy is effective or maximum prices are effective, or indirect taxes or minimum prices are effective. Are there trade-offs between equity and efficiency? Again, and what policies are politically feasible as well? It's not just a cost effective, or are basically policies politically feasible or not, right? So also एक और चीज़ मैं आपको बता दूँ, we're going to be talking about evaluation paragraphs and how could you start off your evaluation paragraphs. So और मैं देखें, I mean it catches me by surprise honestly that a lot of you people just are looking at me saying that we need this. I mean, it's honestly sometimes also sad for me that you guys must be knowing this stuff, right? And हमने तो पूरे साल हमने अपने स्टूडेंट्स को इस पर बहुत फोकस कराया है, बिकॉज देखें इकोनॉमिक्स में ना, एंड फॉर नेक्स्ट ईयर आई एम गोना बी टेलिंग यू कि आप हमेशा अपने टीचर्स को ये कहा करें, आपको जो भी पढ़ा रहा है, चाहे आपके कॉलेज के टीचर्स हैं, आपके ट्यूशन के टीचर, उनको बोलें आप कि भाई हमें राइटिंग स्टाइल सिखाएं, बिकॉज कंटेंट तो देखें पब्लिकली अवेलेबल होता ही होता है. आप कहीं से भी पढ़ लेंगे, इंटरनेट से पढ़ लेंगे, यूट्यूब की कोई वीडियो देख लेंगे, किसी और के नोट से पढ़ लेंगे, बट forcing your teachers to actually train you and teach you the best way to write an answer is very very important, because actually game जो है ना वो आंसर राइटिंग की है. मैं आपको बहुत ऑनेस्टली बता रहा हूँ इस बात का. अब आप देखें, अब आपके एवेल्यूएशन के पैराग्राफ जब आप स्टार्ट कर रहे हैं, सो इफ़ यू आर स्टार्टिंग ऑफ योर एवेल्यूएशन, how can you start off your evaluation? For example, you're done with assessment objective 1, you're done with assessment objective 2, and now you are starting with assessment objective 3. So how can you start off an evaluation? For instance, you could say however is very common. However, this policy may not be effective. Again, you starting off your evaluation. That being said, the impact of this policy depends on, again, evaluation. इसका स्क्रीनशॉट ले लें आप. While this argument has merits, it assumes that, ठीक है, while taxes and subsidies have a lot of benefits, while monetary policy might have a lot of benefits, these policies assumes whatever. And उसके बाद, in contrast, because you see, when you're starting an evaluation, your examiner must clearly know that you're starting an evaluation. As in, your examiner must know that now your evaluation has started. Your examiner must know that you have a judgment paragraph or a conclusion. That is why I say paragraphing is very, very important. You have to at least write minimum 4 paragraphs. आपका assessment objective 1 का paragraph, analysis का paragraph. Analysis could be broken down into multiple paragraphs. Evaluation, separate paragraph. अलग से नज़र आना चाहिए that you have a separate paragraph. Then is your final conclusion paragraph. Separate होने चाहिए. Separate होने चाहिए. होने हैं. In contrast, an alternative view is that, again, evaluation. In contrast, an alternative view is that, so for instance, ये वाला point is very, very important, especially when you are talking about the fact that classical economists believe that economies self-heal and self-adjust. So they believe in very less government intervention. So you could talk about the fact that, monetary policies like fiscal policy or monetary policy might really not be needed, especially if the recessions are very small. And classical theories said that economies would self-adjust. So you could mention this point. Can we start as conclusively? It can also be argued. Conclusively ka word use, I would suggest that you use when you're writing a conclusion or when you're writing your final judgment, as in your final judgment. In contrast, it could be argued, आप बोले conclusively का मतलब है you're making your final statement. From a different perspective, it could be argued that this raises a potential trade-off. So if you're talking about यहाँ ये monetary policies में बहुत आएगा काम, this raises a potential trade-off. Yeah, even when you're talking about taxes, I mean, indirect taxes are regressive in nature, right? Subsidies could result into huge strain on public finances as well, and even subsidies could result in complacency and firms. It could make inefficient firms more dependent. In evaluation, the evidence and the data contradicts this view. ये बहुत important होगा case studies वगैरह में. I mean, this is your this is very important when, especially when in your case study, if they're asking you if the data is suggesting this or that if the data is suggesting that this is happening or not, so you could talk about in evaluation, the evidence and the data contradicts this view. So that's all, guys. That's all you need to know, and I think we are majorly done here. Sir, final judgment, evaluation, conclusion, both are different. No, एक second. Conclusion में final judgment आती है. The conclusion includes your final judgment. However, evaluation precedes your conclusion and judgment. So it's a conclusion / judgment, and evaluation precedes that. The evaluation ends on a conclusion or judgment. So conclusion or judgment is your final stand on something, right? So yeah, that's about it. Now guys, 1-2-3 important बातें मुझे आपसे करनी है, और वो important बातें जो हैं वो ये हैं कि important बातें इनफैक्ट मैं अभी नहीं करूँगा. I will be making an Instagram video right now. The moment I end my live session, 2-3 बातें मुझे आपको बतानी है regarding पहले केस स्टडीज़ करनी है नहीं करनी. पहले केस स्टडीज़ ही करनी है, by the way. You have to attempt the case studies first. And the reason why I'm going to be saying that, I'm making an Instagram video. The moment I end the live stream, I will be making an Instagram video. Beta, I have explained this multiple times in the final framework. I would really recommend you to watch that final framework video on 2x, binge watch it. There's a difference between evaluation and a conclusion. Conclusion is your final remarks. Evaluation is not a conclusion. ये बहुत मिस वो है. आप मार्किंग स्कीम भी देख लें. मार्किंग स्कीम में भी असेसमेंट ऑब्जेक्टिव 3 में दे हैव क्लियरली रिटन evaluation followed by a conclusion. So evaluation, like Sidra said, evaluation comes first, then comes the conclusion. That is absolutely correct. Now guys, you need to wait for that video. Inshallah, in the next half an hour that video will be up on Instagram. उसमें आपको बताऊंगा मैं why should you attempt the case study first. Now and उसमें भी मैं कुछ बातें बताऊंगा, इधर बताता हूँ because right now आप लोग सामने बैठे हुए हैं. कल आपका सबसे बड़ा चैलेंज क्या होगा? This is a very right now head to head talk with you guys. Like, you know, I hope first of all these live streams are very helpful for you, and I wish I could do more of these live streams, but we don't have time now. And I honestly, from the bottom of my heart, I really pray that you guys just nail it tomorrow, inshallah. One thing I would honestly tell you guys is that आपका कल biggest challenge would be time management. Your biggest enemy to conquer tomorrow is not that you will not know the exam, you will not know what to write. You will know what to write tomorrow because obviously you guys are good students, you have studied, you will be studying later in the night as well. So you will be knowing what to write. Your biggest threat or the biggest challenge is time management. This will be your biggest enemy. You will be, tomorrow what will happen is that you will be trying to finish the paper, but the time will be working against you. All the forces in the world tomorrow, all the forces in the world will come together and they will make sure that tomorrow your paper is not finished on time. Yes, ये कल होगा आपके साथ. All the forces in the world, every time your paper ends on time. Whenever you attempt a paper on time, it ends on time. But tomorrow, something bad will be acting against you. What I am trying to say to you is, exam pressure आप पे होगा. You have to make time management. You have to make sure time management. और टाइम मैनेजमेंट कैसे करनी है? कल आपने वॉच लेके जानी है, डिजिटल वॉच नहीं, एनालॉग क्लॉक लेके जानी है. योर पेन, यू शुडंट बी यूजिंग अ बॉल पेन. आई मीन यू गाइज मस्ट हैव अ प्रॉपर पेन. लाइक आई रियली सजेस्ट माई स्टूडेंट्स, ये आपका सुबह अब तो टाइम नहीं है, आई डोंट नो, आपका ये ग्रिप पायलट का आता है जेल पेन, तेज़ लिखने वाला जो पेन होता है, वो आप लेके जाएँ कल. बॉल पेन से नहीं लिख सकते आप, यू शुड हैव अ फास्ट राइटिंग पेन. तो अब अगर अभी बुक स्टोर जा सकते हैं, ग्राफ आपको पेंसिल से बनाने हैं बेटा. यू हैव टू ड्रॉ द ग्राफ्स फ्रॉम पेंसिल. ठीक है, यू हैव टू ड्रॉ द ग्राफ्स फ्रॉम पेंसिल. एंड आई वुड एड्रेस, आप ये सारे 3-4 आपके जो भी सवाल है ना, आप ये चैट में लिख दें ताकि मैं ये सारे एड्रेस कर लूँ इंस्टाग्राम की वीडियो में. अभी जैसे अभी किसी स्टूडेंट ने पूछा शुड वी ड्रॉ ग्राफ विद अ पेंसिल, तो ये सारे सवाल आप इधर लिख दें एक एक करके ताकि मैं ये एड्रेस करूँ इंस्टाग्राम वीडियो में. डार्क पेंसिल से आप बनाएं। दूसरी चीज़ ये कि आपने कल सबसे पहले केस स्टडी अटैम्प्ट करनी है, और क्यों करनी है तो मैं उस पर बताऊँगा, बट 40 मिनट्स के अंदर अंदर आपने केस स्टडी को वाइंड अप करना है कल। उसके बाद 15 मिनट्स फॉर 8 मार्कर क्वेश्चन, 25 मिनट्स फॉर 12 markers. सही है? So you attempt the 15 marker and then the 25 marker. I mean, you attempt section A first, you wind it up in 40 minutes. The remaining time you have to dedicate to 40 minutes to section B, 40 minutes to section C. 40 minutes में भी 15 minutes maximum 15 minutes to section A, 25 minutes to section B. Also remember, for instance, अगर आपके पास टाइम ख़त्म हो जाता है, जैसे मैं आपको बता दूँ, इफ़ लेट्स सपोज आपका एक क्वेश्चन रह जाता है और आपके पास टाइम नहीं है, ठीक है, जैसे कि अब ये 12 मार्क का क्वेश्चन है, असेस वेदर इन्फ्लेशन इज़ हार्मफुल। अब इसमें फॉर इंस्टेंस आपके पास 5 मिनट्स रह गए और 5 मिनट्स में यू डोंट हैव द टाइम टू राइट द होल आंसर। तो आपने इन्फ्लेशन की डेफिनेशन दी। नाउ इंस्टेड ऑफ राइटिंग दैट यू हैव 2 टाइप्स ऑफ इन्फ्लेशन, यू गिवन द डेफिनेशन ऑफ इन्फ्लेशन, यू इमीडिएटली मूव ऑन टू द डिसएडवांटेजेस एंड देन द एडवांटेजेस। 2 डिसएडवांटेज बताया छोटी छोटी लाइनों में, फिर एडवांटेज बताया, फिर कंक्लूजन दिया। लेकिन आपने देखें आपने क्या किया यहाँ पे, आपने साइकोलॉजिकल ट्रिक प्ले करी। व्हाट इज दैट? You write the introduction, you write the analysis, evaluation, and then you ended up with a conclusion. Although your conclusion is not the best conclusion, in fact, it is one of the bad conclusions, but still you did complete the paper. You have to complete the paper tomorrow. You write a lot tomorrow, you end up wasting time. In case studies, you're supposed to write short answers, to the point answers. You end up writing long answers. Examiners are not impressed by long, detailed answers. You can write short answers, मतलब lengthwise, but they have to be complete in terms of analysis and evaluation. But you have to finish the paper tomorrow. You have to finish the paper tomorrow. Even अगर आप इस क्वेश्चन को भी देखो, इस क्वेश्चन में भी बहुत छोटा लिखा है, लेकिन कंक्लूजन भी है, एनालिसिस भी 2-3 लाइनों की लिखी हुई है, एवेल्यूएशन भी छोटा छोटा सा लिखा हुआ है. बट द स्टूडेंट हैज written everything. He or she has made sure that the answer is very small, because that's all what you can write in the next 5 minutes. But चाहे आप एक डिसएडवांटेज और एक एडवांटेज ही दो, लेकिन इवेल्युएशन करके जाओ और कंक्लूजन भी भले एक लाइन का लिख के जाओ, लेकिन कंप्लीट आपने करना है पेपर कल. छोड़ नहीं सकते, पेपर आपका छूटा नहीं चाहिए. If you end up writing an excellent answer in section, let's suppose your section B goes very, very well and you write them very, very well, but your section C goes bad. So this is not a good thing. But if your section B goes average and your section C goes average as well, this is much better than doing one of the sections very well and the other section not that well. ठीक है. So ये हो गई बात. देखिए सेक्शन सी का मैं आपको क्या दिखाऊं. ये केस स्टडी का सोल्यूशन है. आज आई अपलोडेड ऑन माई I uploaded to my students today. You can see the 6 marker. This is May June 24 variant 3. This is a 6 marker answer. This is May June 24 variant 3. 6 marker. May June 24 पेपर 2 वेरिएंट 3. मैंने आज ही अपलोड करा है अपने रजिस्टर्ड स्टूडेंट्स को प्लेटफॉर्म पे. सो ये आपका 6 मार्कर है. ठीक है, गॉट इट. ये दूसरा 6 मार्कर है. ये तो 8 मार्कर है उसमें केस स्टडी. ये केस स्टडी का 8 मार्कर है. ये भी अपलोड किया है. ये आज ही अपलोड किया है मैंने उनको. नहीं बल्कि कल अपलोड किया है. गैस कल अपलोड किया है. ठीक है, गॉट इट. सो इसमें आपको ना प्रशांत इज आस्किंग दैट इस तरह के आंसर में हाउ मच कैन यू गेट. सी इस तरह के आंसर में यू कैन एटलीस्ट गेट 6 to 7. 6 मिल जाएंगे आपको. हाफ मिल जाएगा इसमें. यू विल स्कोर हाफ. Scoring half is important than talking about demandable inflation and you're talking about you're making the diagrams. देखें ये जो डायग्राम बनाने का एक वो है ना, ग्रेटिफिकेशन है आपको. एक समझ लें कि ये एक लोगों को मतलब कोई खप्त है डायग्राम बनाने का, कि डायग्राम बना कर ही आना है. नहीं डायग्राम के बगैर हम एग्जामिनर हमें मतलब फेल ही कर देगा. भर दो डायग्राम बनाओ. ऐसे डायग्राम नहीं बनाना. आपने डायग्राम अगर आप बना भी रहे हो तो आप डायग्राम को एक्सप्लेन करना बहुत ज़रूरी है कि व्हाट इज द पर्पस ऑफ दैट डायग्राम, व्हाई यू आर मेकिंग दैट डायग्राम, व्हाट इज दैट डायग्राम शोइंग. केस स्टडी में यू हैव टू लिंक इट विद द केस स्टडी. तो आंसर तो केस स्टडी से ही होगा ना, तो वो ऑटोमेटिकली लिंक हो रहा होगा. डिपेंड्स अपॉन द क्वेश्चन. ऑब्वियसली द आंसर विल बी फ्रॉम द केस स्टडी, सो यू अल्टीमेटली इट विल बी लिंक्ड. योर आंसर्स विल बी लिंक्ड. और केस स्टडीज़ देखें आप, हमने कितनी केस स्टडीज सॉल्व की हैं. हमने बहुत केस स्टडीज सॉल्व की हैं लाइव स्ट्रीम्स में. 6 केस स्टडीज़ आई थिंक हम सॉल्व कर चुके हैं. नहीं 4 कर चुके हैं केस स्टडी सॉल्व. और 10-11 केस स्टडीज़ तो मैंने ऑलरेडी पेपर 2 की यूट्यूब लाइव उस पर डाली हुई हैं, ठीक है। पैराग्राफिंग करके आनी है, एक्सप्लेनेशन सही, एवेल्यूएशन सही होनी चाहिए, अच्छी होनी चाहिए। ऑल्सो या दैट्स अबाउट इट। देखें, इफ़ यू आर एबल टू स्कोर 35 on 60 सो यूर गुड टू गो, उस पर आपका ए आ जाएगा। बिकॉज थ्रेशोल्ड जो होंगे वो कल के पेपर में भी, जो कल पेपर होगा ना उसमें थ्रेशोल्ड जो होगा अगर बहुत अच्छा हुआ तो 24-25 out of 60 होगा ज़्यादा से। 25 से ऊपर थ्रेशोल्ड नहीं जाना, बिकॉज लोगों को लिखना नहीं आता एग्जाम में। इट्स नॉट दैट पीपल डोंट नो इकोनॉमिक्स, इज दैट दे आर नेवर टॉट हाउ एंड व्हाट टू राइट। दैट इज़ वाई द थ्रेशोल्ड्स आर ब्रूटली एंड पैथेटिकली एंड मिजरेबली लो इन द एग्ज़ाम। एंड अगर आप देखें A2 का थ्रेशोल्ड ज़्यादा होता है, A2 में 35-36 पे होता है। क्यों होता है? क्योंकि जब AS में बच्चे बुरा स्कोर करते हैं तो वो रीटेक देते हैं, दे लर्न द राइटिंग स्टाइल, एंड द पीपल हु एंड अप विद सो either the people with a D or an E or an U, they either drop economics or they give a composite by learning and doing it properly. और स्टूडेंट्स जब AS से O लेवल से AS में आते हैं तो वो समझ रहे होते हैं AS भी O लेवल की तरह हम करेंगे, एंड में पढ़ लेंगे। टॉपिक्स वही होते हैं लेकिन बहुत डेप्थ होती है इसमें। और खैर मैं तो उस पर एक दफ़ा इफ़ आई स्टार्ट ऑन इट देन आई विल नेवर स्टॉप। सो यू डोंट हैव टू पैनिक। देखें, थिंग्स दैट आर नॉट इन योर कंट्रोल आप वो करें जो आपके कंट्रोल में है। देखें, आपके कंट्रोल में क्या है? आपके कंट्रोल में है कि आप इस वक्त जाकर आपके जो अगले 3 घंटे हैं या 4 घंटे आप पढ़ोगे, 3 बजे के बाद आपने नहीं जागना, लेकिन आप जो ये पढ़ोगे ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है फॉर इस 3 घंटे में आपने इट्स योर मेक और ब्रेक। एंड गाइस आई थिंक आई वोंट बी टेकिंग अ लॉट ऑफ टाइम बिकॉज आपको घर जाके पढ़ना, आई मीन आपको पढ़ना भी है। सो आई थिंक आई आल्सो नीड टू मेक अ वीडियो। लेट मी सॉर्ट ऑफ नाउ एंड इट, and I think let's sort of put an end to this, and I wish you the best. You guys have been great, and हम इसी तरह इंशाल्लाह अपना streams P1 की streams करेंगे इंशाल्लाह। कल you guys have to make me proud. Yes, 8 marker के अंदर 2 marks evaluation के होते हैं, yes होते हैं। Okay guys, so I'll see you all inshallah tomorrow, and all the best and good luck.